campfire glows in the dark, faces half lit and half lost, Dutch pacing with a sermon on freedom, Hosea quiet in the shadows, Arthur sharpening a knife while the world closes in around them. This is the gang as memory remembers it, on the edge of collapse, hunted by Pinkertons and betrayed from within. But this is not where the story begins. To understand what they became, the flame has to be turned back to its very beginning. Before Arthur Morgan ever rode into that circle of wagons, before John Marston, before Blackwater and St. Denis, there was only a drifting pair of outlaws and a dangerous idea. The Linde gang was not born in a blaze of gunfire. It emerged from its humble beginnings as a conversation, a shared philosophy, a wild dream traded between two conmen who met trying to rob each other. That moment of quiet irony, two lost souls reaching for the same purse, would become the spark for one of the West's greatest tragedies. This is a story of origins, of how Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews first imagined something larger than themselves. Long before the camps at Horseshoe Overlook or Shady Bell, they moved from town to town as confidence men and gentlemen thieves, targeting the rich, the cruel, the complacent. Dutch spoke of freedom and justice, of striking back at a rigged civilization. Hosea weighed the odds and kept him alive. Between them, the outline of a family began to form, a roaming band that would be the living embodiment of resistance to a world that no longer had room for men like them. The scope of this tale lies in those hidden years, in the days before Arthur's name was ever muttered around a fire. It reaches back to Dutch's early life and the anger that shaped his philosophy, to his first robberies and first loves, to the moment Annabelle stepped into his world and the moment Colm O'Driscoll tore her out of it. It follows the first enemies marked, the first hideouts claimed, the first time Dutch's ideals bent in the face of grief. How much of the gang's later betrayal and bloodshed was already written there, in the shadows of these early choices? From the very beginning, patterns were forming. Dutch's rousing speeches and sudden rages, Hosea's quiet doubts, the tension between noble rhetoric and ruthless action, all of it existed before Arthur ever picked up a gun in Dutch's name. The feud with the O'Driscolls, the habit of turning every slight into a crusade, the dream of a free world always one big score away, these were not late inventions. They were the foundation. This episode will walk that road from its first footprint, Dutch as a boy and as a believer, Hosea as partner in conscience, the early robberies that felt righteous, the first campfires that truly felt like family. Who was Dutch before he became a legend? What did the gang look like when it was only a handful of idealistic dreamers chasing the horizon? And when did that dream first begin to crack under the weight of reality? When the world was changing and the old ways were dying in front of their eyes. To understand the man who falls, the boy who hoped has to be seen. The story now turns to that earlier Dutch, the restless son, the hungry thinker, the outlaw who still believed in his own goodness, years before Arthur Morgan ever rode into his shadow. Dutch's story does not begin with a gang or a gunfight. It begins with a boy in the shadow of two ghosts, a wandering mother and a father he would spend the rest of his life hating. From the very beginning, his past is presented in fragments, half-truths and half-myths, the kind of backstory a man tells so often that even he no longer knows where memory ends and performance begins. He speaks of a mother who drifted from place to place, never rooted, never safe, dragging her son through a world that had no patience for poor dreamers. She carried books instead of heirlooms, ideas instead of money. In cold boarding houses and cheap rented rooms, she read to him from poetry, philosophy, and romantic tales of freedom, convincing a lonely child that he was meant for more than ordinary labor under a merciless civilization. In the truest sense, she became his first audience and his first believer. Where the mother gave stories, the father gave scars. Dutch hints at a man who was absent when needed and violent when present, a petty tyrant who beat his family and bowed to larger powers. Authority, in Dutch's mind, first wore his father's face. That private hatred would grow into a public crusade, turning every lawman, banker, and politician into an echo of that early bully. Is it any wonder he later declared war on institutions themselves? This tension, books in one hand, bruises in the other, formed the core of Dutch's young philosophy. It was a story of freedom and resentment, dreams and delusions, of a boy who learned to see himself as both chosen and wronged. The world was changing. the old ways were dying, and he convinced himself that only a man unbound by rules could fix what had been broken. He was a victim in his own mind, but also a visionary who believed destiny owed him an audience. Even as a youth, Dutch was the living embodiment of his mother's stories and his father's rage. He learned early that words could be sharper than knives and softer than lullabies, depending on how they were held. In saloons and campfires, he practiced, turning small lies into grand speeches, petty complaints into sweeping condemnations of government and civilization. People listened. They always did. By the time he met Hosea, Dutch was already a charismatic outlaw in training, quick with a line, hungry for attention, and dangerously convinced that his pain made him righteous. He had begun rewriting his own childhood into a legend, polishing every slight and every kindness into something that justified his rebellion. How long before that same habit would shape the entire gang's memory of itself? In the end, Dutch's past was already half fiction in his own mind. The first person he truly conned was not a mark in a bar or a rich man in a carriage. It was the boy in the mirror staring back and believing every word. Dutch had spent years rehearsing his own legend. Then, one afternoon, the legend walked into a dusty little town and met its first real editor. It was the kind of place civilization forgot, a crooked main street with a half-faded sign promising prosperity and delivering only cheap whiskey and cheaper lies. Dutch was working one of those lies. A battered traveling coat, a silver tongue, a story about a sick sister and a crooked railroad man. He had a local merchant halfway fleeced, dazzled by talk of justice and easy profit. What Dutch did not know was that the merchant was already marked. Hosea Matthews had picked him out that morning, watching from the porch of the livery, hat low, eyes sharp. Hosea was running his own angle, quieter and less theatrical forged deeds, a land scheme, the promise of oil under worthless dirt. 2 cons, 1 mark, and each man convinced he was the smartest in the room. Their first meeting was not a handshake. It was an interruption. Hosea stepped into Dutch's performance with the calm of a man entering his own parlor, gently correcting a detail in Dutch's invented story, then producing proof that undercut Dutch's pitch. For a moment, the merchant's faith wavered. 2 strangers, 2 versions of salvation. Which liar to trust? What followed was a duel of wits in the truest sense. Dutch raised his voice, painted pictures of rail barons and tyranny, turning the con into a crusade. Hosea lowered his, spoke of risk and prudence, of quiet fortunes made far from prying eyes. One sold philosophy, the other sold practicality, and as they fenced with words, each started to see through the other's act. Hosea spotted the hunger behind Dutch's rhetoric, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about freedom and the old ways were dying. Dutch noticed Hosea's restraint, the way he measured every promise, never saying more than he had to. The attempted double cross began to feel less like competition and more like a test. Who would blink first? In the end, the merchant bolted, clutching his money and cursing both of them. The job was a failure. The moment was not. On the boardwalk outside, there was a pause, a hand near a gun, and then laughter. 2 conmen who had just tripped over each other's schemes, realizing they were staring at a mirror from a different angle. From its humble beginnings, that laughter was the real beginning of the Linde gang. Dutch talked first, of course, spinning the fiasco into a story of potential, of what 2 men with real talent could do together. Hosea listened, weighing every word, already counting exits and possibilities. He was calmer, more practical, less in love with his own voice, but just as committed to living as an outlaw on his own terms. Their first joint job came days later, a modest stagecoach outside town. Hosea planned the route, the timing, the disguises. Dutch handled the performance, the gun, the fear. It was a small robbery, barely enough to live on for a month, yet it felt like something else entirely. A story of partnership, of 2 lost souls who had finally found someone who understood the same crooked language. From that day, Hosea became the first real counterweight to Dutch. He could tease him, question him, even say no, and Dutch would listen, at least in those early years. Together, they were the living embodiment of a dream, one man's soaring ideals anchored by another man's hard-earned caution. As the sun dropped behind the hills, they rode away from that first score, saddlebags light but spirits high, laughing and already talking about bigger targets, bigger ideas. A life of freedom carved out against a world that was changing fast. Neither knew it yet, but the philosophy born on that dusty road would gather followers, forge a family, and eventually draw in a young thief named Arthur Morgan, long before the dream began to crack. On those early trails, the money was never the only thing in the saddlebags. The real weight was in the conversations that followed. When the fire burned low and the horses were picketed in the dark, Dutch and Hosea would sit up long after the embers dimmed, talking not just about what they had taken, but what it meant in a world that seemed determined to crush men like them. Those nights were the very beginning of an outlaw philosophy. Dutch would stare into the flames and start to shape a story of freedom and resistance, arguing that civilization was nothing more than a polite word for control. The government, the railroads, the banking men in their fine suits. He called them the true thieves, the living embodiment of a rigged system that stole land, labor, and dignity while pretending to uphold the law. What was a robbed coach, he asked, compared to a stolen country? From its humble beginnings, that argument gave their crimes a strange, almost idealistic sheen. Dutch claimed they were not taking from honest folk, but reclaiming what had been bled out of them by taxes, mortgages, and company scrip. In his telling, every strong box cracked open on a lonely road was a small victory against an empire of ledgers and locomotives. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch insisted that someone had to stand up and say no. Hosea listened, and mostly, he believed. He shared Dutch's hatred of pompous judges and smug railroad agents, and he had seen enough swindled farmers to know the game was stacked. But Hosea was also a conman to his core, and he understood that a good story could sell almost anything. This philosophy kept spirits high, turned guilt into purpose, and wrapped danger in the language of destiny. Did that make it less true, or only more useful? Together they refined an early code, a kind of Robin Hood frame for their growing legend. They would not prey on the poor, the desperate, the ones already hanging by a thread. Their targets would be the powerful, the greedy, the men who could afford to lose a little gold and sleep a little worse. No senseless cruelty. No killing unless there was no other choice. They were thieves, but not butchers, and that distinction mattered to them in the truest sense. That code became the spine of their future family. It turned a pair of drifters into leaders who could offer more than a full plate. They could offer meaning. When Dutch later reached out to a lost soul on a city street or a broken gun hand in some forgotten town, he was not just promising money. He was inviting them into a story of resistance, a place in something larger than hunger and fear. And in those early years, Dutch might actually have believed every word. That belief, clear and bright and uncracked by failure, was precisely what made him so compelling, and what would make him so dangerous once the dream began to slip away. Belief was the spark. Reputation was the fire that followed. The first flames caught on a lonely stretch of road, where the ruts of stagecoach wheels cut deep into the mud and the telegraph lines had not yet tamed the horizon. Dutch and Hosea chose their target with care, a banking company coach, heavy with deposits from ranchers and railroad men, light on escorts that day, because the nearest town was hosting a county fair. From its humble beginnings, their partnership was already defined by patience, observation, and a refusal to leave things to chance. Hosea had ridden that road for a week, trading names with drivers, counting rifles, watching departure times. He noted which coach stopped to water the horses, which one ran through without pause, which guard drank too much in the saloon the night before. Dutch called it fate. Hosea called it a pattern. Between them, fate always had timetables and contingency plans. When the coach finally came, it did not meet a hail of bullets. It met theater. Dutch rode out first, black coat flaring, horse crossing the road in a slow, deliberate line. He tipped his hat, introduced himself as if stepping onto a stage, and delivered one of those speeches that would become legend, about banks fattened on other men's labor, about a world where freedom had been mortgaged to civilization. The driver's hands shook on the reins, but he lived. So did the guards. Hosea moved in the shadows of that performance, efficient and unromantic. While Dutch held every pair of eyes with words, Hosea disarmed the guards, cut the strongbox loose, and kept the timetables in his head. 5 minutes, no more. He was the realist who kept the dreamer from turning a robbery into a sermon that lasted until the posse arrived. Without him, Dutch's philosophy might have ended in a ditch that very day. That balance defined their early heists. A trainside ambush where they loosened a rail just enough to force a stop, then walked the first-class passengers through a strangely courteous ordeal. No women harmed, no poor farmers stripped of their meager savings, no pointless killings. Dutch apologized for the inconvenience, complimented a terrified lady's dress, and promised that history would remember who truly robbed whom. The passengers left shaken, but alive, clutching a story of two outlaws who acted in the truest sense like gentlemen thieves. Word spread faster than the telegraph wires could carry it. In nearby towns, lawmen muttered about a pair who hit hard and vanished fast, who seemed to follow their own strange rules. Among the poor, the tale took on a different color. Some whispered that these men were the living embodiment of resistance, stealing from the powerful in a world where the old ways were dying and the small man was being crushed. Others, more pragmatic, saw only danger and disruption, another reason for the badge to ride through their doors. Each success fed Dutch's certainty. Each clean escape confirmed Hosea's belief that planning could beat almost any gun. Dutch began to believe he could outthink any lawman, outtalk any jury, that his words were armor as strong as steel. Confidence edged into arrogance. The illusion of control grew thicker, more comforting, more dangerous. But the frontier had its own memory. With reputation came attention, and attention in that harsh world always drew more than frightened bankers and admiring drifters. It drew rival gangs watching their territory, informants eager for reward money, and men like Colm O'Driscoll, who saw in Dutch not just a competitor, but an opportunity. The first cracks in their story of perfect control were already forming, even if neither of them could see them yet. That attention did something else, too. It brought into focus the woman who would stand beside Dutch in the very beginning, long before the gang had a name or a legend. Her name was Annabelle, and her presence turned Dutch's wandering philosophy into something that almost resembled a life. Annabelle was not a camp follower or a passing fling. She was, in the truest sense, one of the first real members of what would become the Linde gang, a woman who chose the outlaw world with open eyes. When Dutch met her, she was already surviving on the fringes, working in a noisy saloon in a tired little town, moving between tables with a wary grace that told anyone paying attention she had seen too much to be impressed by easy charm. Dutch tried the charm anyway, that was his nature. But where others swooned at his speeches about freedom and civilization, Annabelle mostly watched him, amused, as if grading a performance she had heard 100 times before. Their first real conversation did not begin with romance. It began with her cutting through his rhetoric, asking what he actually did for the people he claimed to care about. Was this a story of noble rebellion, or just another man talking pretty while filling his own pockets? That question hooked him. Here was someone who saw through the act yet did not walk away. Annabelle believed there was a man underneath the performer, one whose anger at the world was not entirely selfish. Around her, Dutch's better instincts found reinforcement. She could pull him back from his wilder impulses with a single raised eyebrow, or a quiet reminder that dead men did not get to enjoy freedom, and widows did not care how poetic a robbery had sounded beforehand. As Dutch and Hosea's operations grew from their humble beginnings, Annabelle became the quiet spine of their drifting camp. She watched the wagons when the men rode out, tracked supplies, and made sure there was always one more safe house than Dutch thought necessary. When Dutch and Hosea argued over risk and reward, she did not shout. She waited, listened, and then offered a measured word that often landed harder than either man's temper. For a time, her influence made the dream feel real. Nights around the fire were not just about planning the next job, but about telling stories, sharing food, and imagining a small, stubborn family living outside the reach of banks and barbed wire. Dutch could look at Annabelle and see proof that his philosophy was more than delusion. If a woman as hard-bitten and clear-eyed as her believed, then perhaps the world was changing, and the old ways were dying, just as he claimed. Annabelle also personalized his war against authority. He did not just want a world where outlaws could roam. He wanted a world where women like her did not have to bow to leering bosses, cruel sheriffs, or smug gentlemen with soft hands and hard eyes. Protecting her became the living embodiment of his crusade, the emotional core of his rebellion. And that is what would make what happened next so devastating. Because Annabelle's fate would not only shatter Dutch's heart, it would turn a rivalry into a blood feud, a dream into an obsession, and leave a wound that never truly healed, echoing through every choice the gang made in the years to come. Before that wound was opened, though, there was a quieter chapter, from its humble beginnings in the timber and snow of the northern woods. long before the famous camps at Horseshoe Overlook or Clemens Point Dutch. Hosea and Annabelle tried to turn a simple hideout into something more, not just a stopover between robberies, but the very beginning of a home. One of their first real refuges was an abandoned cabin tucked deep in a spruce forest, far off the main trails, where the smoke from the chimney vanished into the trees before any lawman could see it. The roof sagged, the windows were cracked, and raccoons had claimed the pantry. But to three drifting outlaws living day to day, it felt like a promise. A roof, four walls, and enough distance from civilization to breathe. Daily life there was rough and strangely peaceful. Mornings began with the hiss of coffee over an open fire and the scrape of Hosea's knife as he cleaned whatever game he had managed to bring down. Dutch would sit at the table, revolvers broken open in front of him, cleaning each piece with almost priestly care, while he talked about philosophy, about freedom, about how the old ways were dying under the boots of railroads and bankers. Annabelle moved through it all with practiced grace, cooking stews from almost nothing, patching clothes, laughing at their arguments when they grew too grand. At night, plans were drawn in lamplight. Dutch paced the floorboards, sketching routes to stagecoaches and small-town banks, spinning each robbery into a story of justice, a story of taking back what the world had stolen. Hosea listened, poked holes, added details, where to leave the horses, which ridge gave the best view, how long before the nearest sheriff could ride out. Annabelle sat between them, mending a shirt, occasionally cutting in with the simple question neither man wanted to face. What happens after the money is gone? It was in that cabin that Dutch began to see camp as more than a hideout. He talked about turning it into a self-sufficient community, a place where outcasts could live by their own code, free from the hypocrisy of civilization. No landlords, no bosses, no Pinkertons, just loyalty, firelight, and the forest. In his mind, this was the living embodiment of his ideals, not just a temporary escape from the noose. Hosea, ever the realist, made sure those dreams did not get them killed. He set lookouts in the trees, cut hidden trails through the underbrush, and buried extra rifles in hollow logs along the escape routes. Where Dutch saw a sanctuary, Hosea saw lines of approach, blind corners, and how quickly a noose could tighten once a posse caught their scent. Between them, idealism and survival met in uneasy truce. Annabelle became the heart that held it all together. When a job went wrong and Dutch came back bruised and furious, she calmed him. When Hosea doubted Dutch's schemes, she listened to his worries, then nudged him back toward his friend. She bandaged cuts, broke up arguments over shares, and made that crooked little cabin feel, in the truest sense, like a family home instead of a den of thieves. Word spread, as it always does. A drifter with a bullet in his shoulder staggered in 1 week, a small-time horse thief the next. Then a former ranch hand who had shot the wrong foreman. Some stayed a few nights, took a hot meal and a place by the fire, then vanished back into the wilderness. Others lingered, drawn to Dutch's speeches or Hosea's quiet competence or Annabelle's steady kindness. Each new arrival tested the fragile balance between camp and gang. In those evenings around the fire, with stories traded and weapons laid close at hand, a pattern formed that would define everything to come. Dutch as the visionary, talking about a world that could be. Hosea as the planner, making sure they survived the world that was. Annabelle as the heart, turning a cluster of outlaws into something that felt almost holy. And around them, a slowly growing ring of lost souls, watching the flames and wondering if this rough little refuge might be their home too. They had no idea that this simple cabin, half rotten and half mended, was the blueprint. The model for every camp, every fire, every doomed attempt to build a free community in a world determined to crush it. But that fragile little blueprint in the woods did not exist in a vacuum. In the same rough towns, on the same dusty roads, another vision of an outlaw family was taking shape, and it would haunt Dutch's dream from the very beginning. His name was Colm O'Driscoll. Where Dutch read books and quoted speeches, Colm learned his lessons in back alley beatings and prison yards. Dutch talked about freedom, about civilization as a cage. Colm talked about survival, about getting through the winter with enough men still breathing to ride again. If Dutch and Hosea were building an idealistic campfire congregation, Colm was building a pack of wolves. From its humble beginnings, the O'Driscoll gang moved through many of the same territories, the Grizzlies, the Heartlands, the ragged edges of the railroad. A stagecoach that went missing in one county would turn up stripped in another, and no one could quite tell whether it was Dutch's boys or Colm's men who hid it. Rumors spread in saloons and rail depots. There was another leader out there, another charismatic outlaw who could walk into a room and own it with a glance. The world was changing, and in that shifting landscape, Dutch and Colm became aware of each other long before they ever exchanged a word. A planned robbery would go bad because the safe was already empty. A contact in town would suddenly vanish after doing a bit of business with some other gang. Once, Dutch and Hosea rode hard for a small town bank, only to find O'Driscoll riders already in the street, guns smoking, money bags half loaded. Two philosophies, one target, and for a heartbeat, it almost turned into two gangs trying to rob the same place and each other. The differences, though, were stark. Dutch wrapped his crimes in a story of resistance, insisting they robbed the rich and spared those who did not stand in their way. Colm cared nothing for such distinctions. Dutch wanted loyalty earned through belief. Colm accepted loyalty bought through fear. Dutch wanted to be admired, even loved, as the living embodiment of an idea. Colm was content to be a name muttered in terror when lamps were blown out at night. Dutch used that contrast. Around the fire, he spoke of the O'Driscolls as everything they were not: butchers, thugs, men with no code. In the truest sense, Colm became his dark mirror, the example he pointed to whenever doubts surfaced. Were they just bandits? No, he would say. Bandits were O'Driscolls. Yet beneath the speeches, something more complicated simmered. Dutch was fascinated by Colm, by the notion that another man could command such brutal loyalty without promising freedom or justice. Only spoils. Was Dutch's philosophy a higher truth, or just a prettier mask for the same hunger? The old ways were dying, and there was not room for two rising outlaw kingdoms in the same shrinking frontier. Safe houses burned, informants played both sides, and every ruined score tightened the noose. A collision was coming, and when Dutch and Colm finally met face to face, that meeting would not just start a feud, it would set the course of both gangs for years of blood and betrayal to come. The collision came on a rain-slick evening outside a nameless rail town, where Dutch and Hosea had planned what was meant to be a clean, almost bloodless score. A payroll train, a quick detach of the safe car, a retreat into the trees. From its humble beginnings, their operation had always tried to balance risk and restraint. But that night, another pack had caught the same scent of money. The first sign was not gunfire, but laughter in the dark. As Dutch's men moved along the tracks, lanterns hooded, a second crew emerged from the opposite tree line. Guns low but ready, green coats, rough faces, that easy, mocking swagger. The O'Driscolls. Two outlaw kingdoms, one prize, and no room for compromise. For a heartbeat, it was almost comical. Two gangs stepping on stage to rob the same train, each suddenly an audience to the other's performance. Dutch stepped forward first. He always did. He spoke with that practiced calm, announcing that his people had planned this, that they would take the risk and Colm's men could walk away with their pride intact. He drew a line, in the truest sense, between his philosophy and theirs. This was a job, not a massacre. This was survival, not butchery. He even framed it as a favor, as if granting Colm the chance to avoid unnecessary blood. The response was scorn. O'Driscoll gunmen chuckled at Dutch's speech, trading jokes about the gentleman outlaw and his little sermons. One of them spat on the tracks, another raised his rifle just a fraction too high, and the moment snapped. No warning shot, no final threat, just a crack in the wet night, and a Linde rider dropped, dead before he hit the mud. The world was changing, and mercy did not impress men like Colm. What followed was chaos. Muzzle flashes tore through the rain, horses screamed, lanterns shattered and turned the scene into a stuttering hell of light and shadow. Dutch's early followers, many still half in love with the dream of robbing the rich and riding off laughing, saw that dream drown in the mud. This was not a story of clean scores and grateful townsfolk. This was a story of rival wolves tearing at the same carcass while civilization rolled past on iron rails. When it was over, the train had fled, the money was gone, and the tracks were lined with bodies from both sides. In the cold aftermath, Dutch and Hosea took stock. They tightened their perimeter, armed even the camp followers, and began rotating watch in ways they had once dismissed as paranoid. Freedom, they realized, would not be protected by speeches alone. Could ideals survive if every ride might end in an ambush? For Dutch, something else had changed. Until then, his hatred had been reserved for the law, the bankers, the agents of a closing civilization. Now it had a face, a laugh, a name whispered over fresh graves. Colm O'Driscoll became more than a rival. He became the living embodiment of everything Dutch needed to stand against. From that night on, the feud stopped being about territory or money. In Dutch's mind, it became a story of good outlaws versus bad outlaws, a necessary delusion that would justify every bloody choice still to come. From that moment, the feud stopped being an incident and became a rhythm. One blow, then another. One ambush answered by a raid. One burned camp answered by a pyre of smoking wagons on the horizon. What began as a story of betrayal between two former partners turned into a grinding cycle of tit-for-tat violence that reshaped the gang from its humble beginnings. The first counterstrikes were almost restrained. Dutch and Hosea would catch a pair of O'Driscoll riders on a lonely trail, strip them of their horses, and send them stumbling home on foot, bruised but breathing. Colm answered with an ambush of his own, rifles cracking from the tree line, one of Dutch's boys left bleeding in the mud. After that, the gloves came off. O'Driscoll scouts vanished and turned up hanging from cottonwoods. A Linde cache was discovered and torched. Cartridges popping in the fire while Dutch watched from a ridge and swore that the world would remember his name. Each skirmish forced a change. Camps that once lingered for weeks now lasted days. Dutch's people slept lighter, packed faster, learned to move at a moment's notice because somewhere out there, Colm's men were doing the same. The gang that had once prided itself on clever robberies and minimal bloodshed began planting dynamite under bridges, running nighttime horse raids, and killing suspected informants before questions were fully answered. Survival demanded harsher tactics. Dutch told himself it was temporary. Hosea knew better. Hosea watched the shift with growing unease. He had seen Dutch angry before, but this was different. This was personal. Decisions that had once been weighed against risk, against the safety of the family, now hinged on pride. Was the hit worth it? Did the message sound loud enough? More than once, Hosea argued for restraint, for disappearing into another state, for letting Colm stew in his own failures. Dutch would listen, nod, and then ride out anyway, chasing a rumor of O'Driscoll's with a fire in his eyes that had nothing to do with philosophy and everything to do with wounded ego. In the middle of that storm, Annabelle tried to hold the camp together. She moved from fire to fire, calming the frightened, tending the wounded, reminding them that this was still, in the truest sense, a family and not just an army. When Dutch returned from a raid, coat blackened with smoke and temper still burning, she would stand close, hand on his arm, and quietly ask about the children, the old men, the women who had followed him into this war. Was he fighting for them, or only against Colm? Ironically, the bloodshed drew in fresh faces. New recruits arrived with stars in their eyes, eager to join what they had heard was a righteous struggle against a cruel rival. They repeated Dutch's speeches about freedom and civilization, about the old ways were dying, and saw themselves as heroes rather than outlaws. The reality was messier, rustled horses, shallow graves, and a leader who could no longer walk away from a slight. Yet the drama of the feud gave the gang a legend, and legends are powerful bait for a lost soul with nowhere else to go. In this escalating war, the future Dutch of Red Dead Redemption 2 was being forged. A man who could not let go of grudges. A man willing to risk everyone to prove a point. Each raid, each burning shack, each name crossed off in revenge pushed him further from that early, idealistic dream and deeper into delusion. And somewhere out on those dark roads, an answer waited. One last act of retaliation would take something irreplaceable. When that blow finally landed, there would be no going back to the simpler days before Arthur, before Blackwater, before everything began to fall apart. The answer came on a cold night, when the gang was camped in a narrow valley, fires banked low, horses tied close, and the air thick with the quiet confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. They had pulled 3 good jobs in a row. Spirits were high. Dutch had been talking again about finding some land of their own. Then the shots started. It was not a duel, not a grand showdown between rival kings of the frontier. It was a message. Rifles cracked from the ridgeline, muzzle flashes winking in the dark. Men dove for cover, horses screamed, lantern glass exploded into sparks. Annabelle stepped from Dutch's tent at the first sound, hand going to the pistol at her hip, eyes searching the shadows. One bullet found her before she could draw. Clean, cruel, precise, she fell in front of Dutch. For a heartbeat, he did not move. The man who could talk through any crisis, who could turn panic into purpose with a few well-chosen words, simply stared at the blood spreading across her dress. Hosea shouted orders, dragging people behind rocks, firing back at the unseen O'Driscolls. The camp scrambled. Dutch knelt. There were no tears. Not then. Not from him. Shock hardened into something colder, a silence that felt heavier than the gunfire. When he finally stood, he did not rush to Annabelle's side again. He reached for his revolver, for his rifle, for the only language this world seemed to respect. Grief did not break him in that moment. It sharpened him. The gang survived the raid, but the camp did not. The canvas and wagons could be replaced. The sense of safety could not. Annabelle had been the living embodiment of home for these outlaws, the one who turned a ring of wagons into a family table, who stitched torn clothes and bruised egos in equal measure. With her gone, the fires burned colder, no matter how high the flames reached. From that night forward, Dutch refused to let her death remain a senseless act. He turned it into a story of martyrdom, retold around every new campfire. Annabelle had died, he said, not just as his lover, but as a symbol of what Colm O'Driscoll and men like him would always try to destroy: freedom, fellowship, the dream that misfits could live outside a corrupt civilization. Was that true, or was it the first great myth he built to protect himself? Hosea heard the change before anyone else. Dutch's speeches grew harsher, his plans more personal. This was no longer just a philosophy of resistance. It was a private war. Hosea worried that Dutch's need to make the world pay would drag their growing family into a feud they could never truly win. A feud that had begun as a friendship and curdled into pure betrayal. In the truest sense, Annabelle's death marked the very beginning of Dutch's long slide toward paranoia and cruelty. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and now he believed that love itself was a weakness enemies would exploit. From that moment on, he was not just an idealistic outlaw with a gun. He was a wounded man, convinced that the world could not be made better, only forced, one bloody act at a time, to pay its debts. From that wound, the entire shape of the gang began to harden. Dutch had lost Annabelle, and in his mind that meant he could not afford to lose control of anything else. What had once been a loose circle of drifters and dreamers started to look, in the truest sense, like a campaign under a commander. Camps were placed with more care, sentries were posted more strictly, and every robbery was sketched out as if it were a battle plan rather than a gamble. He had always been a planner, but now planning became obsession. Dutch walked the perimeters at night, rehearsing routes, escape paths, and contingencies, drilling even the old hands on signals and formations. A stagecoach holdup was no longer two men with bandanas and bravado. It was a small operation, with lookouts on ridges, backup riders in the trees, and a clear chain of command. The gang that had started from its humble beginnings as a pair of conmen running clever tricks was slowly turning into the living embodiment of an outlaw army. Their targets stayed grand: banks, rail depots, the mansions of railroad barons and crooked officials still drew Dutch's eye, because his philosophy demanded that the rich and powerful pay. But the way those jobs unfolded began to change. There was less patience for negotiation, less tolerance for anyone who got in the way. A guard who reached for a gun, a clerk who hesitated with the safe combination, a deputy who happened to be on patrol at the wrong moment. These people were no longer simply obstacles to be avoided. They were examples to be made. Hosea felt that shift more acutely than anyone. He had built this life on misdirection and charm, on the belief that the smartest outlaw was the one whose name the law never quite confirmed. He argued for quieter scores, for swindles and forgeries that left no bodies in the dust and no headlines in the papers. Why bring the world down on them for the sake of a little fear? Why trade freedom for the constant roar of pursuit? But Dutch's rhetoric was changing. What had once been speeches about carving out a space beyond civilization now darkened into proclamations of war. In his telling, the world was changing not gently but violently, and the old ways were dying under the boots of bankers, railroads, and governments that had already taken everything from them. Each robbery became not just a crime, but a strike in an endless conflict against an enemy, so vast it could never be clearly seen, only blamed. New blood heard those speeches first, not the campfire stories of the early days. Recruits arrived to a camp where guns were cleaned in rows, where drills were barked, where Dutch stood not as a wandering philosopher, but as a general addressing his troops. Some came chasing dreams of family and freedom. Others came because there was power here, real power, in a world that had tried to make them small. In this era, the patterns familiar from Red Dead Redemption 2 began to crystallize. Dutch's love of the grand gesture, of the big, risky score that would finally prove him right, took firmer root. His enemies multiplied in his mind. Colm, the O'Driscolls, the law, the railroads, the whole machinery of civilization, until every setback felt like part of a conspiracy. When a plan went wrong, it was never flawed, it was sabotaged by a treacherous world that did not understand his vision. And always, the ideology was there to explain away the blood. A town terrorized was a town awakened. A lawman gunned down was a symbol destroyed. Each questionable decision could be folded back into the story he told, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an embattled family standing alone against a merciless age. The result was a gang more effective, more feared, and more dangerous than it had ever been. Jobs paid better, their name carried further, and for a time it seemed that Dutch's harsher methods were working. Yet beneath that new armor, the structure was growing brittle. The more everything depended on Dutch's plans, Dutch's temper, Dutch's shifting sense of who was friend or foe, the more vulnerable they became to the next great blow of fate. One disaster, one betrayal. That could shatter the entire illusion of control he had built. That illusion of control held the gang together, but beyond the campfires and shared spoils, the wider world was beginning to push back. From its humble beginnings as two conmen on the road, Dutch's little band now existed inside a growing web of allies, informants, and enemies who watched every move, judged every robbery, and carried tales from one dusty town to the next. Some of those towns quietly chose the gang side. In half-forgotten settlements where the railroad hadn't reached yet, Dutch and Hosea became whispered legends rather than wanted men. A general store in a poor farming community would find its ledger mysteriously balanced after a job, or a rancher beset by rustlers would wake to see the thieves run off by unseen riders. Was it charity or strategy? For Dutch, there was no difference. He bought loyalty with coin and protection, and in return, those communities closed their doors when lawmen came asking questions. But not everyone was so easily charmed. Early on, a county sheriff named Malloy in one frontier district began to notice a pattern: stagecoaches robbed with minimal bloodshed, witnesses describing a tall man quoting philosophy, and a smooth-talking partner who smiled as he lied. Malloy started keeping a notebook, a private ledger of his own. Dutch van der Linde, Hosea Matthews. Those names began as pencil scratches in a back office, then became the living embodiment of a new kind of outlaw in wanted posters pinned to saloon walls. Bounty hunters followed. Men such as Eli Horvath, a former cavalry scout turned tracker, took contracts on this noble gang that stole from rail companies and taxmen. The irony was almost comic, Dutch styling himself as a defender of the common folk, pursued by men who had once defended the Union and now hunted him for pay. Their cat-and-mouse games through canyons and border towns became a story of patience and escalation, each side learning the other's habits. Dutch understood that image mattered as much as gunsmoke. He cultivated his own myth, speaking in saloons about freedom and civilization, railing against government corruption in the same breath that he planned train robberies. He wanted to be seen, in the truest sense, as a necessary counterweight to a rigged world. Yet as the pressure mounted, the gang's methods hardened. A guard who once might have been tied up and left behind was now more often left bleeding in the dust. The consequences spread outward. When a bank in a growing rail town was hit, the company demanded results. Deputies rode through nearby farms, kicking in doors, questioning families who had once taken Dutch's money with quiet gratitude. Children watched fathers dragged into the street, not because they had stolen anything, but because they might have seen something. Innocence paid for the gang's legend with sleepless nights and broken windows. Hosea, ever the observer, saw the pattern before Dutch would admit it. The world was changing. Railroads carved steel lines through valleys where the gang had once vanished without a trace. Telegraph wires carried descriptions of their faces faster than any horse. Pinkerton agents began appearing in rail offices and city halls, selling a new promise that private law and organized force could tame men like Dutch forever. The old ways were dying, and Hosea knew it. Where Hosea saw a closing door, Dutch saw confirmation. Every new law, every fresh spur of track, every Pinkerton badge flashed in a small town street became, to him, proof that his war was righteous and that time was running short. The dream of freedom hardened into something more desperate, more brittle, more willing to sacrifice strangers for survival. And so a new need emerged. If this dream was to endure, if the gang was to stand against an entire civilization marching west, it would require fresh blood, new recruits, new lost soul after lost soul, strong enough or knave enough to carry the weight of Dutch's increasingly dangerous promise into the next chapter. By the time that fresh blood began to arrive, Dutch's way of leading was no longer improvisation. It was ritual. From its humble beginnings as two conmen running stagecoach scams, the gang had become the living embodiment of Dutch's personality. Charismatic on the surface, rigid underneath, Dutch led as a preacher more than a general. Around the fire, his voice rose and fell in practiced cadences, turning each robbery into a parable, each narrow escape into proof that fate itself rode at their side. He called them family, promised freedom, wrapped every command in affection, yet beneath that warmth sat a growing need to be obeyed. Praise flowed easily. Contradiction did not. Those who questioned him in public found the air go cold, the smile harden, the conversation end with a quiet, unmistakable warning. His greatest tools were stories and speeches. When a job went wrong, Dutch framed it as a temporary misstep in a grand design, a story of progress marching inevitably toward victory. When a job went right, it was never just luck or skill. It was destiny, validation that his philosophy was righteous and that civilization was the true criminal. How could anyone doubt a man who could turn every setback into a lesson and every success into a sign? That was the spell. Hosea balanced that spell. In the truest sense, he was the quiet co-leader, the one who took Dutch's sweeping dreams and translated them into routes, timings, and exit plans. He questioned Dutch, but almost always in private, over a bottle or a map, nudging him away from madness and toward something survivable. When tempers flared in camp, Hosea smoothed them, turning Dutch's grand speeches into practical reassurance. Dutch inspired, Hosea made sure no one died for a line in a monologue. Yet even in these earlier, more idealistic years, patterns of control and denial were hardening. When others disagreed, Dutch could charm them, cajole them, or, when pressed, intimidate them into silence. But he almost never admitted fault. If reality conflicted with his narrative, then reality was wrong. A failed job became sabotage, a warning became cowardice. The world was changing, and he refused to let that change reach his reflection. That refusal bred the first real paranoia. The feud with Colm O'Driscoll, Annabelle's death, the constant pressure of the law, all of it convinced Dutch that betrayal lurked in every shadow. He began to remember slights forever, to hold grudges with a near-religious intensity, to see potential traitors where there were only frightened outlaws trying to survive. These habits would echo through Red Dead Redemption 2. The same man who once dismissed doubts in a young gun hand would later dismiss Arthur's pleas for caution, then John's desire to leave as treachery. The same hunger for flattery that once drew him to applause around a campfire would make Micah's constant praise sound like truth. The same stubborn faith in doomed plans would carry the gang from Blackwater to St. Denis to Beaver Hollow, long after hope had gone. So by the time Arthur Morgan ever heard Dutch speak, the die was already cast. The speeches were polished, the philosophy rehearsed, the cracks invisible in the firelight. The old ways were dying, but Dutch's patterns were set in stone, and those patterns would one day pull his entire family down with him. By the mid-1880s, those patterns had already hardened into a way of life. The Van der Linde gang stood on the edge of a new chapter, no longer a wandering pair of dreamers, but a small, dangerous enterprise that lawmen whispered about and outlaws watched with envy. Dutch and Hosea were seasoned partners now, in the truest sense. Years of running cons, robbing stages, and slipping through the fingers of sheriffs had forged a bond that felt unbreakable. Around them clustered a handful of early loyalists, men and women who had heard Dutch speak by the fire and decided that this strange, idealistic philosophy of freedom and family was worth bleeding for. Their names were not yet legend, but their presence gave the camp weight. This was no longer just two clever thieves. This was the beginning of a world. Their feud with the O'Driscolls had already turned from irritation into obsession. Colm and Dutch, once the living embodiment of a shared outlaw dream, now circled each other as bitter enemies, trading ambushes along back roads and leaving bodies in muddy ditches. Annabelle's death at Colm's hands hung over every decision, a phantom at the edge of the firelight. It was not just a killing, it was the moment Dutch's rhetoric of justice began to blur into personal vengeance. As the gang's reputation grew, the jobs changed. Gone were the days when Dutch and Hosea could drift into a town, run a clever con, and disappear with a satchel of cash. The operations became more organized, more ambitious, and far more perilous. Carefully scouted stagecoaches, well-timed payroll hits, coordinated distractions in dusty main streets. Each score promised more money and more proof that Dutch's philosophy worked. But every bigger take drew a bigger response. County posses grew sharper. Pinkerton agents began to file reports on this charismatic outlaw who quoted literature between robberies. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. Around the camp, the mood wavered between warmth and exhaustion. There was laughter, shared meals, and stories of close calls that had already become legend. There was also the quiet counting of the dead, the empty bedroll that had belonged to Annabelle, the scarred faces turned away when Dutch spoke of destiny. This was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, already written in gunpowder and grief before Arthur ever rode in. Dutch and Hosea could feel time pressing on them. Nights ran colder, rides felt longer, and both men understood that if their grand experiment was to survive, it needed younger, stronger hands. They did not yet know the name Arthur Morgan. They had not yet crossed paths with a runaway named John Marston. But the thought was there. Apprentices, heirs, someone to carry the torch when their own aim began to waver. Beyond their campfires, civilization crept closer. Railroads carved through valleys, telegraph wires stitched territories together, and the Pinkertons rose as the iron fist of a modern state. For men like Dutch, this was both enemy and justification, proof that his war against progress was righteous even as it became impossible to win. So this pre-Arthur era stands as both prologue and foundation. From its humble beginnings as a partnership between two conmen, every choice, every mercy, every cruelty, every robbery in the name of freedom laid the tracks for what would come. The triumphs at their peak, the betrayals in St. Denis, the tragedies at Beaver Hollow, all trace back to this moment when the gang still believed the dream might hold. Somewhere out there, a teenage outlaw was already learning to steal, already drifting toward destiny. The next rider to approach Dutch's camp would not just be another recruit. When Arthur Morgan finally entered this story, the Linde gang would never be the same again. But before Arthur Morgan rode into camp and changed the shape of this family, there was another presence that defined Dutch's world. Before the surrogate son, there was the woman at his side. Annabelle's story begins in the shadows of the same civilization Dutch despised. Born to working people in a small town that never cared to remember her name, she grew up watching railroad men and bankers carve up the horizon, watching the old ways were dying while the powerful congratulated themselves. Some say she worked in a saloon, others whisper she ran from a cruel husband or a crooked sheriff. The details blur, but the pattern is clear. She was no stranger to injustice long before she met an outlaw with grand ideas about freedom. When Dutch and Hosea crossed her path, the meeting was not a fairy tale. It was a negotiation. Dutch brought fire, philosophy, and that dangerous charm. Hosea brought caution, experience, and a conman's read of character. Annabelle listened to their talk of a gang that would be more than thieves, a story of resistance and family, and saw something rare in the truest sense: criminals who spoke about protecting the weak instead of preying on them. For a woman already discarded by the respectable world, riding with outlaws who claimed to live by a code did not feel like falling. It felt like a choice. From its humble beginnings, the early gang moved through mining camps and half-built railroad towns, hitting stagecoaches and petty tyrants, sleeping under the open sky. Dutch loved to talk. Annabelle preferred to watch. Where his idealistic speeches soared, she grounded them with quiet questions. Did they need to rob that train today? Could they spare that frightened clerk? Was Dutch proving a point, or just proving himself? In those years, she became the living embodiment of the restraint Dutch still believed he possessed. There were moments when her influence changed the shape of the gang's history. On one job, Dutch planned to blow a safe in a small-town bank, leaving chaos behind. Annabelle noticed the family living in the rooms above and pressed him to wait, to scout, to find a cleaner way. Hosea backed her. Dutch relented. They hit a stagecoach outside town instead, and no one died. On another night, after a robbery turned bloody, Dutch wanted to ride back and finish off a posse that had humiliated them. Annabelle sat with him by the fire, her hand on his shoulder, reminding him that vengeance drew Pinkertons, and Pinkertons ended dreams. In those conversations, the early code hardened: steal from those who had more than they ever earned, protect those who had nothing, avoid killing when fear would do. Annabelle was not the gang's leader, but she was its conscience, a quiet current pulling Dutch away from the abyss he would one day embrace. How fragile was that balance? How much of his better nature depended on one voice beside the fire? Because that voice would not last, and when it was silenced, Dutch's dream would start to twist. That silence did not come all at once. Before the gunshot that ended Annabelle's life and warped Dutch's dream, there was a brief, fragile era when that dream drew people in rather than drove them away. This was the first circle, a handful of early believers and drifters orbiting Dutch, Hosea, and Annabelle, turning a partnership into something approaching a family. From its humble beginnings, word of their exploits moved faster than the men themselves. A stagecoach relieved of its wealthy passengers without a single shot fired. A pompous banker in Annisburg swindled out of his own bonds. A cruel rancher in New Hanover woken to find his safe empty and his abused workers mysteriously paid. These stories traveled down bar counters and across campfires, and with each retelling, Dutch became less a man and more the living embodiment of resistance to a rigged civilization. The first to drift in were not legends, but working outlaws and hangers-on. There was young Davy Callender, long before his doomed ride to Coulter, running errands and watching the horses. An aging thief named Orwin, who had lost most of his nerve but not his hands, teaching card tricks to anyone who would listen. A half-starved woman, Martha, who had fled a mining town husband and found in Annabelle the first person to look her in the eye and ask what she wanted from the world. Each was a lost soul in need of a story to belong to. Dutch made sure that story had rules. Loyalty, above all. Share the take, no skimming, no secret deals, no unnecessary killing. Fear and theater were better tools than blood, at least in the truest sense of his early philosophy. Help the poor when it cost nothing, and sometimes even when it did. In return, he promised something most of them had never had: a measure of freedom, a place at the fire, a name that meant more than whatever the law had branded them. Camp life in those days reflected that promise. Mornings began with Hosea's coffee, black and burnt, and Annabelle's biscuits, which everyone pretended were better than they were. Evenings stretched long, lit by flames and stories, Hosea recounting a failed con in St. Denis, Dutch reciting scraps of poetry he half remembered, Orwin dealing cards while Davy tried, and failed, to cheat him. It was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but in that moment it felt simple. It felt safe. The world was changing, and somewhere in the distance the old ways were dying, but around that first fire, the gang believed it had found a way to outrun both. This early circle set the pattern that would define the Linde gang for decades. Not just a crew of criminals, but a wandering, makeshift family bound by rhetoric and shared meals as much as by stolen money. The template was set. All it needed now were the sons Dutch had not yet met. Those early fireside speeches did not stay theoretical for long. Philosophy had to meet the barrel of a gun. The first real test of Dutch's code came on a rutted trail in the territories, where a lacquered black stagecoach rattled under the weight of strongboxes and silk. Dutch and Hosea had watched that coach for weeks, counting guards, noting patterns, learning which days it carried mine owners and railroad men fattened by the new industrial world. When the ambush finally came, it was almost theatrical. A felled tree across the road, Hosea in the brush with a rifle, Dutch stepping into the dust with his coat flaring, revolver low, voice calm as he ordered the driver to halt and the rich passengers to step down. He made a show of it. He always did. Dutch announced that this was not a robbery, but a tax on parasites bleeding the land dry. He let the terrified driver keep his pay, tossed a coin purse back to a maid clutching her rosary, and focused his fury on the mine foreman and the railroad accountant. To the poor, he played the gentleman outlaw. To the powerful, he played judge and executioner. It was a story of justice told at gunpoint. No one died that day, but the passengers went back to town shaking, spreading tales of a mad philosopher in a wide-brimmed hat who quoted freedom while emptying their pockets. In Dutch's mind, the contradictions did not matter. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and he cast himself as the living embodiment of resistance to a civilization built on greed. From its humble beginnings, every job became a sermon. Planning a small-town bank scheme in a place where the vaults held rancho profits and railroad deposits, Dutch stood over the map and turned logistics into ideology. They would avoid hurting clerks and tellers, he insisted. They would burn ledgers, not homes. They would show that the government's laws were instruments of capital, not of morality. Was it theft? Or a correction to a rigged ledger? On the ground, the reality was messier. A clerk froze and had his nose broken by the butt of a rifle. A woman screamed so loudly that Dutch slapped her to silence her. Children watched from alleyways as masked riders thundered away with bags of cash. The gang rode off high on adrenaline, while a town full of ordinary people lay awake that night, listening for hoofbeats in the dark. Yet those noble robberies drew in certain hearts. Drifters who hated the railroads, former soldiers disillusioned with the union they had bled for, farmhands crushed by debt. Each heard Dutch speak and believed, in the truest sense, that this was more than crime. To them he offered not just money, but meaning, a wandering family, a philosophy, a chance to turn personal anger into a grand cause. That was the hook. Before Arthur, before John, before the gang became a legend, and then a warning, Dutch's stagecoaches and bank jobs were recruitment posters written in gunpowder and rhetoric. Those who answered that call would help turn a handful of robberies into a roaming community, and they would discover that dreams of freedom can be the first step toward lifelong captivity. Because once Dutch had believers, he could never afford to stop believing himself. The next generation was already on the horizon. Belief needed boundaries. If Dutch was going to turn a handful of drifters into the living embodiment of a new way of life, he had to draw lines in the sand and swear never to cross them. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang did not present itself as a pack of butchers. Dutch spoke of freedom, of family, of taking back a world that had been stolen by bankers and railroads, and he wrapped that philosophy in rules. No hurting women and children, no killing unless there was no other choice. Share the spoils, stand by your own. In the truest sense, it was meant to be a code, not just a slogan. Around campfires and in cheap hotel rooms, those rules were repeated until they sounded like scripture. Dutch would tell some new recruit, a lost soul with nowhere else to go, that they were different from the O'Driscolls, different from the gangs that burned homesteads for sport. They robbed stagecoaches, not orphanages. They took from the rich, not from the poor farmers they claimed to protect. Was it really justice, or just a prettier story for the same old crime? There were moments when those lines were tested. One winter in the Grizzlies, an early member named Harlan lost his temper during a botched holdup, pistol whipping a terrified woman after the money was already in hand. The air went still. Dutch's gun was out before anyone could breathe. He didn't shoot Harlan. That would have been easy. Instead, he dragged him to the edge of camp at dawn, stripped him of his share, his horse, his gun, and told him he walked alone from that day on. In that frozen silence, the message was clear: cross the code, lose the family. But Dutch was not the only keeper of that illusion of honor. Hosea, quieter and more practical, watched for the smaller cracks. When Dutch raged about killing a lawman who had forced their hand, Hosea would be the one to ask if there truly had been no other way. When a score came in light, Hosea made sure the split was still even, slipping coins into a youngster's hand so Dutch's grand speeches about sharing the spoils did not ring hollow. More than once, Hosea enforced rules Dutch had begun to bend. When Dutch proposed hitting a train rumored to be carrying families alongside its strongbox, Hosea talked him down, reminding him that their war was with civilization's masters, not its passengers. Yet even there, the world was changing, and so was Dutch. A few extra threats at gunpoint became necessary persuasion. A roughing up turned into sending a message. Each compromise was dressed in poetry, each rationalization another brick in a crumbling wall. Those early years were a story of ideals holding back instinct, of honor straining against hunger. For a time, the lines in the sand held. But every successful job, every close call, pushed Dutch a little further toward believing that the rules existed to serve his dream, not the other way around. And dreams, once they begin to bend, have a way of finally breaking. The next recruits would arrive into that tension, inheriting not just the code, but the hairline fractures already running through it. Those fractures had a name waiting to widen them. Colm O'Driscoll. Before Arthur ever rode under Dutch's banner, Colm's shadow already stretched across the territories. To settlers pushing west, his gang was a whispered threat behind every creaking wagon wheel. To lawmen, they were a recurring nightmare, too slippery to catch, too vicious to ignore. And to other outlaws, they were a warning. There was always someone willing to go further, to be crueler, to treat the world as nothing but prey. Colm's reputation was built on simple principles. Strike fast, hit hard, leave nothing behind that could stand up again. Farmsteads burned. Stagecoaches vanished without a trace, save for a bloodstained wheel track in the mud. Sometimes bodies were left hanging from trees on the edge of claimed territory, a wordless message that civilization was not welcome here. In the truest sense, Colm ruled by fear, not by belief. That was where Dutch drew his line, at least from its humble beginnings. Dutch saw himself as a teacher, a philosopher, a man with a code in an uncaring world. He spoke of freedom and family, of stealing from the rich and corrupt and sparing the poor when possible. Colm, by contrast, was a blunt survivor. He played the fool in saloons, slurring his words, stumbling over his own boots, letting men underestimate him before he gutted them in the dark. Dutch talked. Colm watched. Dutch dreamed out loud about a better world beyond the reach of the law. Colm counted bullets, scouted escape routes, and made sure his men feared him more than the rope. One led with speeches and ideals, the other with beatings and buried corpses. Yet beneath Colm's rough manners lay a cold, deliberate cunning that made him the living embodiment of what Dutch claimed to hate. Power without principle, violence without restraint. The two outfits felt each other long before they truly met. A stagecoach Dutch and Hosea had planned to rob would turn up empty, already taken by men with green neckerchiefs. A contact in a border town would be found dead in an alley, pockets turned out, a crude O carved into his boot heel. Once, Dutch's crew staked out a train only to spot O'Driscoll riders slipping away in the distance, smoke still curling from the locomotive's broken safe. Was it coincidence, or a game between predators circling the same ground? Rumors spread of stolen jobs, crossed territories, and shared informants playing both sides. Dutch insisted his gang was different, that they were outlaws with a cause, while Colm's men were rabid dogs. Yet each time an O'Driscoll move cost them money, the line between philosophy and pride blurred a little more. This rivalry became more than a contest over loot. It was a story of identity and ego, of dreams and delusions clashing in the dust. Dutch needed Colm to be the monster, the proof that his own brutality was justified. Colm needed Dutch to be the rival, the man to beat, the legend to drag down into the mud. And when blood was finally spilled between them, it would not just reshape their gangs. It would set Dutch on a path that no speech could ever walk back. So when the first real meeting finally came, it was not in a courtroom or a church, but in the ruins of a dying farm on the edge of nowhere, a burned-out homestead, a dry well, a few blackened beams clawing at the sky. The perfect place for two rising outlaws to pretend they were men of principle rather than predators dividing up a carcass. Both sides arrived armed and wary. Dutch and Hosea rode in with a half-dozen men. Annabelle among them, rifles slung low, faces calm but eyes sharp. Across the yard, Colm O'Driscoll appeared with his own riders, rougher, louder, the living embodiment of the chaos Dutch claimed to be fighting. Between them, an old campfire pit, ringed in stone, waited to be lit, as if the land itself demanded a ritual before the talking could begin. From the very beginning, Dutch tried to turn that parley into a story of ideas. He spoke first, of course. He talked about territory, about boundaries, about how the world was changing and the old ways were dying, about how their gangs could avoid needless bloodshed if they respected each other's sphere of operation. It sounded almost diplomatic, almost civilized. Almost Colm listened, chewing a matchstick, eyes half-lidded, pretending boredom. When he answered, it was in the truest sense a rejection of Dutch's philosophy. He did not care about speeches. He cared about money, about cattle, about rail depots and payroll coaches, and which towns were too scared to fight back. Freedom to Colm was not an idealistic dream. It was who held the guns and who paid the bribes. Their words circled each other the way their men did, hands hovering near holsters. Dutch called Colm a capable man with unfortunate methods, a barbed compliment that painted him as crude muscle. Colm replied that Dutch was a smart fella who talked so much he must be afraid to pull a trigger, a veiled insult that questioned his nerve. Each line carried both respect and threat. Each smile stopped short of the eyes. In that firelit ring, they recognized something rare, an equal. Not a sheriff to outwit, not a banker to rob, but another man who could shape a region by will alone. Was this meeting a chance to avoid a war, or the first chapter in a feud that civilization itself would not easily bury? In the end, they agreed on a kind of peace. Dutch would work one side of the territory, Colm the other. No ambushes on the road without cause, no poaching each other's jobs, no open season on families and camp followers. It sounded reasonable. It sounded almost hopeful. But even as the truce was spoken, both men were already calculating how to break it. Hosea saw it in Dutch's distant stare. Colm's lieutenants saw it in the way their boss gripped his reins. From its humble beginnings, this understanding was a delusion, a fragile promise laid over greed, pride, and wounded egos. The fire burned low, the riders melted back into the dark, and for a brief moment the frontier held its breath. Peace had been declared. The question was not if it would fail, but when, and what unforgivable act would finally shatter it. The answer came in pieces. It came on cold mornings and moonless nights, in the form of bodies, burned wagons, and missing riders. The truce between Dutch and Colm did not explode all at once. It frayed, it rotted, until the first real blood price was demanded, and the cost was Annabelle. At first, the provocations were almost deniable. A pair of Dutch's riders went missing on a routine courier run. Days later, their horses stumbled back into camp, saddles cut, bags empty, dried blood on the leather. A stagecoach Hosea had carefully cased was hit hours before the gang moved in, the lock blown in the same way Dutch favored. Coincidence, Colm claimed, if word drifted back. The world was changing, he said. Competition was natural. Then came the messages. A Linde scout found strung up in a cottonwood, boots off, a crude D carved into his chest as if to mock Dutch's philosophy and his name in one stroke. Another man dumped in a creek with O'Driscoll green tied around his neck, throat cut so deep it nearly took his head. These were not robberies. These were signatures. A story of rivalry and wounded pride was turning into something darker, something in the truest sense personal. Dutch tried, at first, to answer with precision. Hit their supply wagons, not their women. Take their guns, not their lives, unless forced. He still believed he could prove himself the living embodiment of a better outlaw, even in a feud. Hosea counseled caution. Annabelle, who had seen enough men die for nothing, urged Dutch to move the camp farther, to put distance between Colm's temper and their family. The ambush came instead. It was a transfer job, simple on paper, move a cache of stolen bonds and coin from a temporary hideout in the hills down to a safer camp in the timber. Dutch rode at the center, Hosea nearby, Annabelle in a wagon with the strongbox under canvas, a rifle across her knees. The road narrowed into a rocky cut, high ground on both sides. The old ways were dying all around them in railroad cuts and telegraph lines, but this was still classic ambush country. Dutch saw the danger a heartbeat too late. The first volley tore through the column. Horses screamed, a rider went down hard, the wagon lurched as a wheel shattered under rifle fire. O'Driscolls rose from the rocks and brush, green coats and bandanas flashing between muzzle flashes. This was no warning shot. This was extermination. Annabelle fought. Witnesses would remember that. She threw the brake, swung the rifle, dropped one man as he charged the wagon. Another shot caught her shoulder, spun her sideways, but she kept firing, reloading with bloody fingers as Dutch shouted orders, dragging wounded men behind overturned carts. For a moment, it seemed the gang might break through. Then Colm stepped into view on the ridge, calm as a hanging judge, and gave a simple cutting command. The next bullet found Annabelle's chest. She crumpled against the strongbox she had been protecting, her blood soaking into the very money Dutch believed would buy their freedom. Something in Dutch went silent. Not rage, not yet. A terrible, stunned quiet, as if the world had shifted out of place. He rallied, he counterattacked, he pulled survivors out and forced a retreat, but those were reflexes, muscle memory. The man shouting orders was a shell-buying time for a howl that had not yet found its way out. In the days that followed, the gang saw the first real cracks in him. Dutch stared at the fire too long, spoke in circles, muttered Colm's name as if testing a curse. His speeches about civilization and corruption grew harsher, less idealistic and more venomous. This was no longer about territory or principle or proving a philosophy. From that moment, Dutch's hatred for Colm was a blood oath. Annabelle's death turned a contest into a vendetta, a rivalry into a crusade. The Linde gang would go on, would even grow, but something essential had been buried with her. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. And the feud that began here would still be burning years later, when a young lost soul named Arthur Morgan finally rode into Dutch's world and mistook vengeance for vision. Vengeance did not arrive all at once. It crept in, the way smoke fills a room, until every breath the gang took tasted of gunpowder and old grief. Annabelle's death had crossed a line, and Dutch decided that if the world was changing, then he would change with it, into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. From its humble beginnings, the feud with Colm had been a contest of wits and nerve, ambush answered with ambush, threats traded in the shadows. After Annabelle fell, it became a campaign. Dutch began ordering strikes on O'Driscoll camps not as defensive measures, but as statements. Men rode at dusk with torches and dynamite, hitting sleeping corrals, burning supplies, leaving bodies in the mud as warnings. Once, Dutch might have spared the wounded. Now he walked among them and made sure there were no witnesses left to crawl away. Hosea saw the shift first. He watched Dutch ride out more often and return with less to say, his eyes distant, his philosophy reduced to a single, brutal equation. An O'Driscoll alive today meant another grave tomorrow. Around the campfire, Hosea tried to pull him back, reminding him of the very beginning, when their story was about freedom, not slaughter. Dutch listened, nodded, even smiled, but the next morning he would be saddling his horse for yet another raid. Others reacted differently. Some were swept up in the fury. There was a grim romance to it, the idea of a righteous war, of avenging a fallen woman who had been, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of Dutch's softer side. Younger guns, drifters, and lost soul stragglers who had joined after hearing whispers of the Linde name found purpose in that fire. They boasted about O'Driscoll scalps, about camps wiped clean, about Dutch riding at the front, coat flaring, rifle cracking in the dark. Dutch justified every escalation by invoking Annabelle. Around the fire, he called her a martyr to savagery, proof that civilization was nothing but a lie told by men with guns and badges. Their war, he said, was not against Colm alone, but against a world that let men like Colm thrive. How could anyone argue with more bullets when framed as loyalty to her memory? How could restraint survive when every hesitation could be painted as betrayal? The cost, though, spread beyond the feud. Charred O'Driscoll hideouts and mass graves drew attention. Lawmen, who once dismissed Dutch and Hosea as drifting conmen and gentlemen thieves, began to hear a different story, a gang leaving trails of dead across counties, a leader whose speeches about freedom now ended in gunfire. Bounties rose. Posses rode out not just to stop robberies, but to prevent the next massacre. By the time the smoke thinned, the gang's reputation had changed. They were no longer merely clever outlaws skirting the edge of civilization. They were combatants in a private war that threatened everyone around them. And into this world of burned camps and whispered atrocities, a young boy named Arthur Morgan would soon ride, ready to believe Dutch's every word, until the first time he saw what those words really did. But long before Arthur rode into that fire, another shadow had started to fall over the frontier. The war between Dutch and Colm did not just scar hillsides and burn outposts. It sent smoke signals to a new kind of predator, lawmen who did not wear tin stars, detectives who answered not to towns but to capital. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang had mostly danced around sleepy sheriffs and half-drunk posses, men who could be outwitted with a fast horse, a fake name, and a change of coat. Now, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and similar outfits began to spread through the West, the living embodiment of a different order. They were professional, patient, and well-funded, a story of methodical record-keeping and quiet surveillance rather than barroom brawls and impulsive manhunts. At first, it was subtle. A stagecoach Dutch and Hosea robbed near Blackwater drew a posse that seemed too organized, too quick to cut off escape routes. A bank clerk in a small town recognized Hosea's face from a crude circular that had not been printed locally. A supposed drifter in a saloon asked too many precise questions about where the gang bought its ammunition. These were early brushes with men who watched patterns, who tracked not just crimes but habits, where Dutch preferred to winter, which rail lines he avoided, how often the gang struck after a dry spell. Dutch noticed. In the truest sense, he always prided himself on seeing the larger picture, on reading the world as if it were another mark. Around campfires, he started talking about ledgers and telegraphs, about how civilization was learning to count every bullet, every body, every missing dollar. The world was changing, he said, and the old ways were dying. Yet even as he spoke of adaptation, of moving farther into the mountains, of staying lighter and more mobile, his feud with calm kept dragging him back into noisy, public violence that drew exactly the attention he feared. There was irony in it. Two men waging a private war over pride and betrayal, each raid and ambush effectively writing a report for the agencies hunting them. Every burned O'Driscoll camp, every hanged Linde scout became another entry in a growing case file. To the Pinkertons, this was no longer just a collection of robberies. It was a developing threat to order itself, a story of escalating outlaw defiance that demanded a coordinated response. The seeds of the later Cat-and-Mouse game were already in the ground. Detectives began to recognize Dutch's philosophy in the testimonies of survivors, his speeches about freedom, his hatred of government, his insistence on family over law. They studied him as one might study a general, predicting where he would strike next. Long before Arthur ever heard the name Milton, the noose had started to tighten. One quiet report and one careful observation at a time, setting the stage for a hunt that would span decades and end in ruin on a cliff's edge. While the law studied Dutch in dim offices and quiet depots, the gang itself was learning something very different out in the wilderness: how to live on the move. Long before the snowbound misery of Coulter or the relative comfort of Horseshoe Overlook, the Linde gang had already turned drifting into an art form, building a traveling world of canvas, firelight, and whispered plans. From its humble beginnings, that world was held together by hideouts that were both sanctuary and staging ground. One early favorite was a half-rotten cabin buried in the pines of the Grizzlies, its roof patched with stolen tarps, its walls lined with crates from past stagecoach jobs. It offered what Dutch prized most in a camp: height, cold, and distance. Pinkertons hated climbing mountains, and bounty hunters rarely followed tracks into blizzards. Up there, the gang could heal, argue, and dream without a telegraph wire in sight. In warmer seasons, they shifted to river islands and lowland clearings. There was a sandbar on the Upper Dakota, barely more than a spit of land with a stand of cottonwoods, that became a temporary haven after a bloody run-in with Colm O'Driscoll. Surrounded by water, with a single narrow channel for boats, it turned Dutch's paranoia into strategy. One entrance meant one direction to watch, one field of fire to prepare. At night, lanterns were hooded, and the only sounds were the river, muffled laughter, and Hosea's low voice spinning another story of easy scores and simpler times. Over the years, setting up and breaking down these camps became a ritual in the truest sense. Susan Grimshaw chose where the tents went and who slept near the wagons. Pearson, long before his stew became a running joke, was already barking for game and complaining about empty lard tins. The men knew their roles. Some gathered firewood, some dug latrines, some rode perimeter. A camp went from bare ground to living village in an afternoon, then vanished at dawn with almost no trace. It was the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. Here for a moment, answering to no one. Between robberies and close calls, these places held the quiet heartbeat of the gang. Javier would tune his guitar under the stars, playing old songs from a world he barely spoke about. Card games dragged on until sunrise, fortunes of a few dollars rising and falling with each hand. Arguments flared over chores, over shares, over Dutch's growing obsession with Colm, then cooled into shared bottles and muttered apologies. Even in hiding, there were small joys, a found book passed around, a new coat admired, a rare day without gunfire. If Coulter, Horseshoe Overlook, and Clemens Point feel practiced in Red Dead Redemption 2, it is because they are the end result of these early years. The gang's nomadic lifestyle did not begin with Arthur. He walked into a story of wagons already grooved by miles, of routines honed by necessity. The old ways were dying, civilization pressing in from every rail line and telegraph pole. But for a time, each new camp still felt like proof that freedom could be carried on wheels. The tragedy is that the same roads that kept them alive were already leading them toward Blackwater, toward St. Denis, and toward the cliffs where that wandering finally ended. But those roads and rail lines did more than move horses and wagons. They moved information, suspicion, and lawmen. To survive in a world that was tightening around them, the gang needed more than bravado and bullets. It needed Hosea Matthews. And Hosea was playing a longer game than almost anyone realized. From the very beginning, Hosea understood that an outlaw who fired a gun drew heat, while an outlaw who sold a dream walked away applauded. One of his classic cons was the New Hanover land opportunity, a story of prosperity spun in smoky saloons and quiet parlors. He and Dutch would pose as agents of a railroad company, selling worthless deeds to swampland or already claimed plots, promising that civilization would soon lay tracks right through them. The Marks did not see thieves, they saw the living embodiment of progress. Two well-spoken men offering a chance to get rich before the world was changing for everyone else. Another favorite was the rigged poker circuit. Hosea would arrive in a town as a weary traveler, losing small hands, nursing a cheap drink, letting the table underestimate him. Dutch, or sometimes a trusted partner, would arrive later, loud and confident, baiting the local high rollers. Hidden signals, marked cards, and carefully timed lucky streaks turned the night into quiet robbery. No windows shattered, no bodies fell. The only thing truly wounded was pride. This was Hosea's philosophy in the truest sense: brains over bullets, patience over spectacle. Where Dutch dreamed of grand statements against banks and railroads, Hosea argued for subtler cuts, for bleeding the system without waking it. Time and again, when Dutch's temper flared or his idealistic speeches edged toward violence, Hosea would pull him aside and remind him that dead men did not enjoy freedom, and hunted men could not protect a family. Their private conversations were the invisible spine of the early gang. Around the campfire, Dutch was the preacher, painting the old ways as noble and the new order as corrupt. Away from the others, in the dark beyond the lantern light, Hosea became his anchor. He would ask the questions no one else dared. How long could they keep moving? How many enemies could they afford? Was this still about helping the poor, or about Dutch proving he was right? Dutch would pace, argue, protest then, more often than not, relent. Without Hosea, those questions might never have been asked. Without his quiet vetoes, whole towns might have burned. His scams kept money flowing when robberies were too risky. His caution kept Dutch's temper from turning every slight into a war. In an era before Arthur's steadying presence, Hosea was the difference between a drifting band of lost souls and a functioning, if fragile, community. Yet, even as he kept Dutch grounded, the pressure was building. How long could one man's long game hold back a world that refused to stand still? Pressure has a way of exposing cracks. Under Dutch's speeches about freedom and family, under Hosea's careful planning, the early Linde gang was already straining, already testing the limits of its own dream. From its humble beginnings as a pair of drifting conmen, the gang had grown into a small outlaw community, and with growth came friction. The first to really push back were not enemies on the outside, but doubters on the inside. Men and women who watched the robberies grow bloodier, the law grow bolder, and wondered whether Dutch's philosophy still matched the world closing in around them. One wagon driver, pulled into a stagecoach job with promises of easy money and no bloodshed, watched a guard die on the road and never truly looked at Dutch the same way again. In the truest sense, this was already a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of people trying to live free while civilization learned how to hunt them. Dutch spoke of codes and higher purpose, but some early members saw the gap between the speeches and the smoke rising from burned-out homesteads. A quiet card sharp named Ellison began asking careful questions after a botched town scam left a deputy bleeding in the street. Why were the jobs getting louder? Why were the Pinkertons suddenly interested in a gang that once prided itself on leaving no corpses behind? The first real break came not with gunfire, but with a ledger. Ellison vanished one night from a snowbound camp, taking a satchel of robbery proceeds and a list of safe houses Hosea had spent years cultivating. Days later, an O'Driscoll ambush hit one of those very cabins, too precise to be coincidence. Whether Ellison sold information to Colm or to the law, the result was the same: dead men in the snow, and Dutch staring at the empty spaces around the fire, convinced that the world was changing and closing its jaws around him. To Dutch, that defection was not a simple theft. It was a personal affront, a denial of everything he believed himself to be. If a man could walk away from this family, from this grand philosophy, what did that say about Dutch's vision? He refused to accept that his own choices might have driven Ellison out. Instead, he told the gang that betrayal proved what he had always warned them about: trust no one outside, tolerate no doubt inside. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's answer was not to bend, but to harden. He began to speak more often about loyalty, about sacrifice, about how a real outlaw stood by the gang even when the world turned against them. Questioning a plan became indistinguishable from treason. Hesitation on a job could be read as the first step toward running to the O'Driscolls or the Pinkertons. Was this still a family, or the living embodiment of one man's fear of being abandoned? Hosea saw the danger in that turn, saw how every loss made Dutch reach for more control instead of more reflection. But the pattern had begun, and it would not stop here. The next time someone ran, it would cut even deeper, and Dutch's response would drag the gang toward a choice it could never take back. That choice began, quietly, around the campfire, long before any bullets flew. Because if Dutch tried to keep bodies from walking away, he kept minds from wandering with something far subtler: stories. In the truest sense, his first weapon was not a gun or a rifle. It was his voice. On clear nights, when the fire burned low and the whiskey had gone warm, Dutch would rise, coat unbuttoned, hair wild from the wind, and begin to speak. Every setback became part of a grand design, every close call woven into a story of resistance against a corrupt civilization that had forgotten its soul. A botched stagecoach robbery? Proof the rich were tightening their grip. A sheriff's posse too close for comfort? Evidence that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that only the brave would stand against it. The younger and more impressionable members leaned in, eyes catching the light of the flames. To them, Dutch was not just a leader, he was the living embodiment of their dreams of freedom. A failed heist turned into a lesson in loyalty. A needless killing became a tragic necessity in a cruel world. For drifters with no last name, for every lost soul who had stumbled into camp with nothing but shame and a gun, his rhetoric offered something priceless: identity. From its humble beginnings, this was how the gang became a family in their own minds. Dutch did not simply describe what had happened, he improved it. The time Hosea had to drag him half-conscious from a riverbank after a deal went wrong turned, in Dutch's telling, into a calculated diversion, a sacrifice he had willingly made to draw lawmen away from the innocents. The night Annabelle talked him down from shooting a man in cold blood became a tale of his restraint, his moral philosophy, her name almost an afterthought. He cast himself, always, as the principled outlaw hero, struggling between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization. The messier details were sanded away. The arguments with Hosea over unnecessary risks became spirited debates about tactics. The moments of doubt, the flashes of fear, disappeared entirely. Was it a lie, or simply the version of events Dutch needed to believe? Over time, even he stopped knowing. This habit of myth-making held the gang together, but it carried a hidden cost. Each retelling pushed the truth a little further out of reach, and every embellished victory made it harder for Dutch to admit failure when it finally came. The story he told around the fire, the legend of Dutch van der Linde, began to matter more than the man himself. And once a man starts believing his own legend, what happens when reality refuses to play along? That quiet fracture, born in those early camps, would widen in the years to come, until Arthur Morgan and others would be forced to choose between the story and the truth. That fracture did not appear out of nowhere. It had been carved again and again by a pattern the gang could never quite escape. A story of hope and disaster repeating itself across the frontier. From its humble beginnings, the cycle was almost ritual. Dutch would stand by the fire or in some dingy boarding house and lay out a bold plan, half philosophy and half performance. Freedom from civilization, money enough to vanish, one more score before the world closed in. Hosea would listen, nod, and then quietly reshape the dream into something that might actually work, trimming the excess rhetoric and turning it into routes, timetables, and contingencies. The gang would ride, the job would go off, never clean, never entirely wrong, and then the world would answer back with blood. An early train job in the 1880s showed the pattern in the truest sense. Dutch had heard of a small express train running north from Blackwater, carrying payroll for a mining company that treated its workers worse than animals. It was perfect for his philosophy: steal from the rich, embarrass a corporation, prove that the old ways were dying and that men could still take what the powerful hoarded. Hosea scouted the line, learned the guard rotations, even bribed a telegraph operator to delay any warning. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it was the Linde gang. They stopped the train on a lonely stretch of track, lanterns burning in the fog, horses stamping in the dark. The robbery itself went well enough. A few guards disarmed, a safe cracked, a payroll bag tossed into Dutch's waiting hands. Then, a nervous brakeman bolted, leaping from the train and sprinting into the trees. One panicked shot from a young outlaw turned warning into murder. The brakeman fell, the shot echoed, and a nearby posse, already on the move hunting other outlaws, heard the gunfire and turned toward it. Two plans collided in the night, two groups of armed men stumbling into each other on a blind curve of track, each thinking the other was prey. The gang escaped, but not without cost. A rider dead, another badly wounded, a horse left behind, and the mining company furious enough to hire private detectives. Within days, wanted posters spread, the law closed in, and Dutch ordered camp torn down and moved yet again. The dream had been money and breathing room. The reality was another frantic exodus. Yet around the next fire, Dutch reframed it as destiny. The dead were martyrs, the flight was proof of their importance, the blood was the price of freedom in a corrupt world. Disaster became narrative. Loss became legend. How many times could that story be told before anyone dared question it? By the time Arthur Morgan met them, this rhythm was already ingrained. Big dreams, daring jobs, unforeseen fallout, and a hasty ride into the dark. It was the living embodiment of Dutch's promise and Dutch's delusions, a loop the gang could not stop riding, even as the world was changing faster than they could run. By the late 1870s, that loop had a center, and its name was Dutch van der Linde. He was still young, still handsome, still capable of lighting up a campfire with a speech about freedom and dignity, but something in him had hardened. Annabelle was dead. Colm O'Driscoll had seen to that. From its humble beginnings as a partnership built on clever scams, his story had become a story of hatred, obsession, and unfinished business. Dutch rode through this changing world with two ghosts on his shoulders, Annabelle's memory and Colm's betrayal. He preached that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying under railroads, telegraphs, and federal lawmen, and that only outlaws with a philosophy could stand against it. Yet, beneath the rhetoric, grief gnawed at him. Every new campfire was another place Annabelle would never see. Every rumor of O'Driscoll's nearby was another excuse to reach for the rifle instead of the ledger. Hosea Matthews saw it. In the truest sense, he had always been Dutch's mirror and moderator, the one who could talk him down from a reckless robbery or a needless killing. But after Annabelle, Dutch's temper ran hotter, his patience shorter, his need to prove himself more urgent. Hosea began to worry that their dream of a roaming, principled outlaw family was slipping into something more chaotic, more personal, more dangerous. So Hosea did what a quiet strategist does. He started looking ahead. He watched the younger drifters in the towns they passed through, the boys hanging around saloons and rail depots, the lost soul ready to take the wrong offer. He told himself he was searching for fresh hands, new riders. In truth, he was searching for ballast, for someone who might steady Dutch, or at least give that restless energy a purpose beyond revenge. By this point, the van der Linde name carried weight. To some, it was the living embodiment of resistance, a band of idealistic thieves who robbed stagecoaches, trains, and corrupt officials while handing out coins to hungry families on the edge of civilization. To others, especially sheriffs and railroad men, they were a plague, a roaming problem that refused to settle down and be hanged. Their reputation was half romance, half wanted poster, and entirely unsustainable. They moved constantly, from mountain shacks to river camps, never staying long enough for the law to tighten the noose. Pinkertons had begun to take notice. State marshals shared stories over whiskey about the smooth-talking man with the fancy words and the deadly friends. The gang was feared, admired in whispers, but increasingly hunted and cornered. How long could any family live on the run before the seams began to tear? On the horizon, the answer was already riding toward them. Somewhere out there, a boy was drifting between petty crimes and empty futures, the son of a petty outlaw, half-formed and angry at the world. His path would cross Dutch and Hosea's, not at the very beginning of their tale, but at a crucial turning point. When he stepped into their camp, Arthur Morgan would not be creating this story. He would be joining a storm already in motion and changing its course forever. Before Arthur ever rode under their banner, the storm broke over a nameless frontier town on the edge of nowhere. Dust, heat, and a single main street of warped boards and peeling paint. It was meant to be simple. Dutch and Hosea had promised the gang a clean score, a quick in and out against men who would never miss the money. From its humble beginnings, the Linde outfit tried to be something more than common bandits. Dutch had chosen the target carefully, a local magnate who owned half the county, kept his workers in debt, and bragged in the saloon that the law was just another tool. It was, in Dutch's words, a story of justice masquerading as robbery. No innocence, no blood. Just a reminder that the world was changing and that the powerful were not untouchable. The plan was precise. Hosea ran the confidence angle inside the bank, charming the clerk with a false investment scheme, while Dutch waited outside with two riders, watching the street, timing every second. In the truest sense, it was the living embodiment of their early philosophy: take from the rich, spare the poor, hurt no one who did not raise a hand. Then a farmhand stepped through the door at the wrong moment and saw too much. The mask went on, the gun came out, and the fragile line between performance and violence snapped. The clerk panicked, the farmhand reached for a rusted pistol at his belt, and someone fired. No one would ever agree who shot first. What mattered was the sound, that first crack of gunfire that turned a tidy crime into a siege. Outside, Dutch froze for half a heartbeat. This was the moment his rules were supposed to matter. No unnecessary killing, no shooting townsfolk, no turning a job into a massacre. Yet the street was already coming alive with shouting, with doors opening, with men who barely knew what was happening grabbing rifles to defend their civilization. How long could ideals stand against buckshot and fear? Hosea moved faster than Dutch. Inside, he shoved the money into a satchel, dragged the wounded farmhand behind the counter, and shouted for everyone to stay down. He spoke to Dutch through the open doorway with a single, hard glance. Not yet. Not like this. He reminded Dutch of every promise they had made to this small, idealistic family of outlaws trailing in their wake. They fired high, into windows and porch posts, driving people back without cutting them down. They used smoke, noise, and timing instead of slaughter, backing their horses toward the edge of town while Hosea covered the retreat. Dutch wanted to stay, to make an example, to show the magnate and his hired guns what defiance meant. Hosea yanked him into the saddle and ended the argument. They escaped with the money. Technically, the code held. The rich man was robbed, the poor were not targeted, and most of the blood on the street belonged to those who had chosen to fight. But the farmhand bled out before the doctor reached him. That night, around a low fire far from town, Dutch called it an unfortunate necessity, the price of freedom in a dying world. Hosea said nothing, staring into the flames, hearing the echo of that first shot. The cracks were hairline, almost invisible, but they were there. This was how the story of their honor truly began to bend. And when Arthur finally rode into their camp, he was stepping into a philosophy already strained, already tested, already stained at the edges. That stain did not stay at the edges for long. It spread in dust and gunpowder, under a wide blue sky, on a lonely road where Dutch's code met the hard face of reality and blinked first. The job itself was simple on paper. A private coach, heavy with bonds and payroll, rolling through scrubland between two boomtowns that were trying to pretend civilization had finally tamed the frontier. Dutch, Hosea, and three early hands waited in a shallow wash, horses tied, bandanas ready, the very beginning of what would become their more organized outlaw operations. Dutch had scouted the route twice, timed the guards' rotations, rehearsed every line of his speech about donations to the cause of freedom. When the coach appeared in a haze of dust, the plan unfolded almost beautifully. Hosea's shot took the lead horse's bridle, not its head, swinging the team sideways without killing an animal. Dutch rode up in front, pistol raised, coat flaring, the living embodiment of his own philosophy, controlled, theatrical, righteous. The guards saw the rifles on the ridgeline and chose life over loyalty. In minutes, the strongbox was on the ground, the passengers lined up, hands raised, hearts pounding. Dutch gave them his usual sermon. This was not theft, he said, but correction. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and men like him were merely balancing the scales. No one would be hurt. No one would be left poorer than the companies that bled them. It was a story of justice wrapped in crime, of dreams dressed up as rebellion. Then one man broke. A clerk in a cheap suit, spectacles cracked from the fall, started babbling. He knew their faces, he swore he did. He'd go to the sheriff, to the Pinkertons, to anyone who would listen. He shouted Dutch's name. Not Mister, not Sir. Dutch? Hosea saw the flicker in Dutch's eyes before anyone else. Recognition, exposure, the future, suddenly, closing in. For a heartbeat, Dutch tried the old way. He stepped closer, voice low, promising the man his life, his wallet, even his watch, if he simply forgot what he'd seen. But fear had its teeth in the clerk. He doubled down, louder now, threatening, promising retribution. The guards shifted. One of the younger outlaws tightened his grip on the rifle. The air turned brittle. Dutch moved before the thought had fully formed. One step. One shot. The clerk dropped into the dust, glasses askew, a dark halo spreading beneath his head. Silence hit harder than the bullet. This was the line. Dutch had preached it for years. No killing innocents, no unnecessary blood. In the truest sense, that rule had been the gang's moral spine, the thing that let them pretend their crimes were cleaner than Colm O'Driscoll's. Now it lay in the road with the clerk. The others stared. One man looked away, jaw tight, as if the sight might swallow him. Another watched Dutch with a new, measuring caution, wondering what else might be flexible in this philosophy that was supposed to be iron. Hosea did not shout. He did not draw. He simply stood there, shoulders sagging a fraction, eyes fixed on the dead man as if trying to memorize the exact shape of this moment. From its humble beginnings, their partnership had been built on shared rules, shared lines in the sand. That sand had just been kicked over. On the ride back, Dutch talked, because silence was worse. He framed it as necessity, as the price of their survival in a world that would never understand men who refused to bow. One dead witness, he argued, meant a living family in camp, meant more jobs, more chances to strike at the corrupt. Was it not better, he asked, for one life to end than for the dream to die? Hosea listened, but something in him had shifted. He began to watch Dutch not only as a friend, but as a man who could now rationalize anything if the stakes were high enough. That day on the road was a story of loyalty and betrayal in miniature, of freedom curdling into delusions. The seed was planted. If Dutch could betray his own rule once, what would stop him the next time the world pressed in? And as the gang grew, as Arthur and others rode under that banner of honor and rebellion, they were joining a family already living with a quiet, unspoken question. Just how far would Dutch go? That question did not vanish when Dutch rode back into camp after that first killing. It followed him. It clung to his coat, rode on his breath, sat in the silence between his words. The gang saw a man returning from a job. Annabelle saw a man returning from a line he could never uncross. He came in late, horse-lathered, jaw-tight. To the others, he was still the living embodiment of their dreams of freedom, the outlaw philosopher who had outsmarted civilization yet again. Dutch told the story in broad strokes, framed in necessity, in the language of survival and destiny. A man had stood in the way. A man had to fall. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and sometimes a gun had to speak for those the law refused to hear. But when the fire died down and the others drifted to bed, that performance ended. In the quiet, the bravado slipped. His hands shook when he lit a cigarette. His voice caught on certain words. He stared too long at nothing at all. Annabelle noticed every detail, because from the very beginning she was watching Dutch, not just listening to him. In their tent, away from Hosea's sharp eyes and the younger hands eager for a story, Annabelle did something no one else dared. She did not ask for an explanation, did not demand a speech about philosophy or progress. She simply asked if he was hurt. She touched the dried blood on his sleeve, not with horror, but with a small, steadying hand, as if grounding him back in a world of human consequence rather than grand ideas. Dutch tried to turn it into rhetoric, to make it a story of sacrifice and necessity. Annabelle let him talk, but she did not feed the performance. She listened, she held him, she reminded him that he was a man before he was a myth. In the truest sense, she became the buffer between his conscience and his legend. To the rest of the camp, that presence was calming. When Dutch paced, Annabelle's voice could bring him to a halt. When he returned from a job with that distant stare, her arm through his dulled the edge. They saw a leader who bled, who loved, who laughed softly with a woman by the fire. It made his anger seem principled, his risks measured, his temper human rather than terrifying. Yet there was a cost hidden inside that comfort. By soothing the man instead of challenging the leader, Annabelle helped Dutch bury his doubts beneath a smoother narrative. If the guilt twisted him at night and she eased it away, did that not prove the killing was survivable, even justified? If he could be held, forgiven, steadied, then perhaps destiny really did demand hard choices. From its humble beginnings, this was how the myth hardened. A wound covered, not cleaned. Annabelle kept Dutch from breaking. She also kept him from fully facing what he had become. And as the gang drew in new blood, they met a Dutch already practiced in that dangerous art of believing his own story. But there was another wound, already festering beneath the surface, one that no amount of tenderness from Annabelle could soothe. From the very beginning, Dutch's dream was not only about freedom from civilization, but about proving himself to the world. And fate, in its usual cruel fashion, handed him a mirror in the shape of another outlaw, with the same ambition. Colm O'Driscoll was not Dutch's opposite. He was his echo. In the early days, before the names Vander Linde and O'Driscoll carried the weight of a curse, the two men crossed paths on back roads and in dim saloons, measuring one another with the wary respect of predators who recognized their own reflection. One week their crews might both be scouting the same stagecoach line. Another, they might quietly trade information about a posse's movements, each pretending it was nothing more than practical courtesy. There were even nights, whispered of later in campfire stories, when Dutch and Colm drank at the same table, arguing philosophy and profit in equal measure. Dutch spoke of the poor, of the rigged system, of a story of resistance against a corrupt civilization. Colm spoke of survival, of taking what the world refused to give. Two men chasing similar dreams, already on diverging roads. The break came over a train. A lucrative payroll run, light on guards, heavy on promise. Dutch and Hosea had worked the timetable for weeks, charting every bend in the track. Colm heard about it through his own channels. At first there was talk of sharing the job, splitting the take, each gang hitting from a different side. It sounded almost civilized, an outlaw gentleman's agreement in the truest sense. Then the Pinkertons were waiting at the rendezvous point. The ambush was too precise, the timing too perfect. Horses screamed, bullets tore through the dark, and men who barely knew one another died in the same mud. Dutch's people clawed their way out, Hosea dragging a wounded boy to safety, Annabelle firing until the barrel smoked. On the far ridge, someone watched through a spyglass and rode away before the smoke cleared. Was it Colm? Someone speaking for him? The question mattered less than the feeling. Betrayal. Dutch blamed Colm. Colm, in turn, claimed Dutch had tipped the law to cut him out. Pride did the rest. What began as competition curdled into accusation, then into open hostility. The next meeting was not in a saloon. It was in a narrow ravine, where Colm's men hit Dutch's camp at dawn. Tents collapsed under gunfire, horses broke their hobbles and bolted, and both sides left bodies on the rocks. An O'Driscoll boy bled out beside a Vander Linde scout. Two lost souls, staring at the same indifferent sky. From that day, reconciliation was nearly impossible. Each dead man demanded an answer. Each answer required more blood. The feud became a story passed between camps, a living embodiment of how the old ways were dying, replaced by organized, grinding violence. Under pressure, Dutch's gang changed. What had been a loose family of drifters became a tighter, more militant outfit. Watches were doubled. Scouts rode farther. Hosea mapped escape routes for every camp. Dutch drilled his people, preached discipline, and wrapped his growing paranoia in the language of protection and loyalty. To survive Colm, the Van der Linde gang had to become sharper, harder, more suspicious of the world and of anyone outside their circle. Long before Arthur Morgan heard Dutch's name, the shape of that future was already forming in gunsmoke and grudges. The O'Driscoll War had begun, and it would define not just their enemies, but who they themselves were allowed to become. To understand what that war truly meant, it helps to see the two generals who were fighting it. On one side stood Colm O'Driscoll, the living embodiment of frontier brutality. On the other, Dutch van der Linde, the self-appointed prophet of freedom and resistance. Their feud was not just a clash of gangs. It was a clash of philosophies, of two very different answers to a world that no longer wanted outlaws at all. Colm's answer was simple. Survive, make money, keep men afraid. His camp was ruled less by loyalty than by terror, less by dreams than by the promise of a quick score and a quicker bullet if anyone stepped out of line. He did not waste breath on speeches about justice or civilization. He robbed whoever was vulnerable, killed whoever was in the way, and switched sides when it suited him. In the truest sense, Colm was a predator adapting to a changing landscape. Dutch, especially in those years before Arthur, wanted to be something else. From its humble beginnings with Hosea at his side, his gang was supposed to be a story of resistance, of stealing from the rich and corrupt and sheltering those ground under the boot of civilization. Around the fire, he talked about freedom, about a world where the poor and the misfits could live by their own code, away from the laws of bankers and railroads. He spoke of family, of loyalty, of a better future just over the horizon. Yet even then, the line between the two men was not as clean as Dutch pretended. Colm ambushed stages and ranches, Dutch robbed them too. Colm shot witnesses, Dutch claimed to avoid needless killing, but bodies still fell when plans went wrong. Both men moved through a world where the old ways were dying, both refused to bend the knee to the new order, and both left a trail of blood in their wake. So what truly separated them? For Dutch, the answer was Colm himself. He used O'Driscoll as a living mirror, endlessly pointing to his rival as proof of what the Van der Linde gang was not. When Colm slaughtered innocents, Dutch reminded his people that they had principles. When Colm betrayed allies, Dutch swore that their family would never stoop so low. Every O'Driscoll atrocity became fuel for Dutch's speeches, sharpening the gang's belief that they were the better outlaws, the last idealistic holdouts in a rotten world. But that comparison cut both ways. The more Dutch defined himself against Colm, the more he needed to believe his own myth. How could he admit mistakes if doing so meant admitting he was no different from the man who murdered Annabel? How could he accept criticism from Hosea or later Arthur when his entire philosophy rested on being the opposite of O'Driscoll brutality? Each time Dutch drifted closer to Colm's methods, he pushed back not with reflection, but with louder speeches, grander promises, and more dangerous schemes. In that sense, Colm was not just an enemy. He was the shadow Dutch could never allow himself to face, the reminder that under all the rhetoric, an outlaw leader still lived and died by fear, money, and the gun. And as the years passed, that shadow only grew longer. If Colm was the shadow, this was the moment Dutch proved he could stand in the light. The first big score did not begin with gunfire. It began with an idea, a map, and a rumor. A railroad payroll wagon, iron strongbox loaded with government wages, passing through a swelling town on the edge of civilization, guarded but not yet prepared for men as organized as Dutch and Hosea. From its humble beginnings as idle talk in a smoky saloon, it became a test of everything Dutch had been preaching. Dutch framed it as more than robbery. It was, in his words, a story of justice, of taking back from the men who fenced in land, broke unions, and paid Pinkertons to hunt the poor. Hosea, ever the pragmatist, saw something simpler, enough money to stop drifting from county to county, enough to feed a growing family of outlaws through a hard winter. Between them, philosophy and logistics finally aligned. Hosea handled the bones of the thing. He rode the route twice under false names, charted where the road narrowed, where the hills rose, where a wagon would be forced to slow. He paid a stable boy for the guard rotation, bribed a clerk for the exact date the payroll would move, and arranged fresh horses at a discreet farmstead. Dutch, in the truest sense, handled the blood. He gathered the crew, spoke of freedom and dignity, turned fear into purpose. Men who had scraped by on stagecoaches and small-town banks suddenly felt part of something larger. On the day itself, the world was changing, but the road looked timeless. Dust, heat, and a thin line of soldiers around a heavy wagon. The ambush was almost theatrical. A felled tree across the trail, a farmer's cart accidentally broken down, Hosea in character as a flustered teamster arguing over compensation while the escort slowed and bunched. Then, Dutch appeared from the brush, rifle leveled, voice calm and commanding. It went smooth. Too smooth, some would later say. The first volley shattered the lead horse's nerve, not the guard's skulls. Dutch had insisted, shoot to disarm, to frighten, to control. Two guards dropped their weapons immediately. Another tried to be a hero and caught a bullet through the shoulder. And within seconds, the escort was on its knees, hands raised, staring at men who moved with drilled precision rather than drunken impulse. The old ways were dying. This was not a barroom brawl. This was an operation. They cracked the strongbox in a dry creek bed miles away, the sun sliding down as neat stacks of government bills and coins spilled into the dust. For the first time, the gang saw what Dutch's promises looked like in metal and paper. New rifles, better horses, real tents instead of patched canvas and branches. A camp that felt, if not permanent, then at least stable. That night, the celebration was the living embodiment of Dutch's dream. Lanterns swung from tree limbs, someone found a fiddle, and even the quiet ones laughed. Hosea, usually reserved, let Dutch pull him into the firelight, both men grinning like boys who had just robbed the whole world blind. Was this not proof that their philosophy worked? That a handful of outlaws, united by loyalty and belief, could bend civilization to their will? Around that fire, a dangerous conviction took root. They were not just surviving, they were ascending. The first big score had done more than fill their pockets. It had told them they were right, unstoppable, destined for greater things. And once a family believes that, what line will it ever admit it cannot cross? But conviction alone could not keep a gang alive. Belief might bind a family together, yet out on the frontier, bullets and bad weather cared nothing for philosophy. If this was to be more than a brief flare of outlaw glory, Dutch and Hosea would have to turn faith into structure, and campfire dreams into something that could move, endure, and survive. From its humble beginnings, the Linde camp had been little more than a pause between robberies. A few tents thrown up wherever the trees grew thickest, a single fire burning low, wagons scattered in a loose ring that was more habit than plan. Horses were tied wherever there was a branch, rifles leaned against wheels, and at night, sentry duty often meant whoever was still awake with a bottle in hand. It was freedom in the truest sense, but it was also vulnerable. As the gang's reputation grew, so did its numbers, and the world was changing around them. The first big score drew in Hangerson, cousins of cousins, drifters and dreamers who heard about Dutch's family and came looking for a place to belong. With more mouths to feed and more guns to hide, that careless sprawl of canvas and wagonwood began to look less romantic and more dangerous. One stray lawman, one ambitious bounty hunter, could have ended the story right there. Dutch talked about ideals. Hosea thought about logistics. Together, they began to reshape the camp. Tents were no longer wherever someone dropped their bedroll, but arranged with purpose, leadership near the center, wagons forming a barrier. A clear path for wagons to roll out at a moment's notice. Duties stopped being informal favors and became daily assignments. One man handled the cooking fire and provisions, another watched the horses, another walked the perimeter in the dark. A loose gathering of outlaws was learning to move like an army. With every forced relocation, the system hardened. When an O'Driscoll scout was spotted, when a deputy stayed too long in the nearest town, the order went out and the ritual began. Fires smothered, tents dropped, valuables packed into pre-assigned wagons. Children and non-fighters knew exactly which wagon to run to, which ravine or tree line to follow if the shooting started. What had once been chaos became choreography. They could vanish before a posse even saddled up. Signals grew out of hard lessons. A particular whistle meant riders approaching. A lantern turned twice on a hill meant scatter, not stand. Travel formations emerged on dusty roads, scouts riding ahead, flankers watching the tree line, the main wagons in the middle, Dutch and Hosea drifting along the column, the living embodiment of command without uniforms. To an outsider, it might have looked haphazard. In truth, it was drilled by repetition, by fear, by experience. Over time, this mobility became more than survival. It became identity. They were no longer just criminals hiding in the woods, but a roaming community with its own rhythms, routines, and rules. Camp was not a place, it was a pattern. It could be rebuilt on a riverbank, in the shadow of a mountain, or in some forgotten clearing, and it would still feel the same. That was the promise Dutch offered every lost soul who rode in. Not just money, but motion, not just robbery, but a way of living outside civilization. Yet every system has a cost. The more organized the caravan became, the more it depended on Dutch's word, on Hosea's planning, on everyone knowing their place and staying in it. The old ways were dying, and this moving camp was their answer, their defiance. But when a family begins to march like a regiment, what happens the first time someone refuses to follow the formation? The first to test that formation were the faces that history forgets. Before Arthur Morgan ever sat at a Linde campfire, there were other guns, other hands, other voices in the dark. Their names rarely passed through legend, but without them, the gang's story of freedom and defiance would have ended almost at the very beginning. One of the earliest was Eli Mercer, a lanky tracker from the Roanoke woods who could read broken twigs the way Hosea read ledgers. Eli had grown up hunting for a lumber camp, watching the forest vanish tree by tree as civilization chewed its way inland. For him, Dutch's promise of roaming without fences was not just a philosophy, it was survival. He walked point on winter rides, found water when the creeks ran dry, and twice led the gang out of Pinkerton Dragnets by following a wounded deer's trail instead of the road. Around the fire, he spoke little, but when he did, it was to warn Dutch that the world was changing faster than their horses could run. If Eli was the quiet scout, then Bridget Calloway was the noise. An Irish demolitions expert who had learned to make bombs for miners on strike, she brought explosives into the gang's toolkit long before the grand bank jobs of later years. From its humble beginnings robbing stagecoaches, the caravan graduated to blowing safes off their hinges in lonely rail depots. The night sky pulsing orange as Bridget whooped in triumph. She laughed loud, drank hard, and sang rebel songs that even Hosea did not fully understand. Yet, in the truest sense, she was the living embodiment of Dutch's early dream, an idealistic outlaw who believed every blast was a blow against a rigged system. There were others whose talents were smaller but no less vital. Old Nate Tisdale, a former wagon cook from the army, turned their chaotic camps into something approaching order, stretching beans and coffee through lean months, and grumbling that Dutch's speeches did not fill bellies. Clara Finch, a local girl from some nameless prairie town, knew every rancher's schedule and every sheriff's weakness, trading gossip for protection and a place by the fire. A wiry horse thief named Jonah Pike could gentle half-wild Mustangs that Dutch saw as both escape route and investment. Each one added a thread, binding the gang into a family that felt for a time unbreakable around those early fires. The nights were not just about planning robberies. They were about Hosea arguing with Bridget over whether dynamite drew too much attention, Eli quietly carving wooden animals for Clara's little brother, Nate cursing as someone burned the stew while Dutch rehearsed speeches about the old ways dying. There was laughter when Jonah tried to serenade Clara and forgot the words, and there was fear when distant thunder turned out to be gunfire instead of a storm. For them, this was not myth. It was simply life. Yet those faces would not last. Eli vanished after a botched job near Annisburg, leaving only his old bedroll and a trail of blood. Bridget died setting a charge that went off too soon. Clara slipped away one morning, tired of running, choosing a dull marriage over glorious danger. By the time Arthur rode into Dutch's world, they were already ghosts, surviving only in Hosea's stories and in the hardening lines around Dutch's eyes. The family had been many things before it became the one Arthur knew. It had already lost more than he would ever see. But ghosts do not haunt the frontier alone. They draw other hunters. As Dutch and Hosea drifted on, carrying their private griefs from one campfire to the next, the world was changing in ways even they could not yet name. The old ways were dying, not with a single gunshot, but with ledgers, telegraphs, and quiet men in press suits taking notes. The first real sign arrived in a town that barely had a name, a muddy crossroads with a rail spur and a single brick bank that Dutch had been eyeing for weeks. The gang rode and scattered, in twos and threes to keep attention low. Hosea went ahead, as always, to feel the air. What he found at the saloon was not a drunken sheriff or some local deputy eager for a bribe, but two well-dressed strangers, boots polished, hats clean, asking careful questions about a string of robberies stretching across 3 states. They did not swagger. They did not threaten. They simply unfolded papers, described a man with a black mustache and a silver tongue, another with a thoughtful gaze and a cough, and a red-haired woman who laughed too loud at danger. They were, in the truest sense, investigators rather than gunslingers, and that made them more unsettling. One of them even bought Hosea a drink, asking if he had ever heard the name van der Linde, as if discussing the weather. Hosea returned to camp with his jaw tight. Dutch listened, then smiled that familiar, dangerous smile. To him, this was just another chapter in a story of outlaw brilliance versus lumbering authority. Had they not been running rings around sheriffs and marshals since the very beginning? Had they not made fools of bankers, railroad men, and every petty agent of civilization that tried to pen them in? 2 men in suits changed nothing, at least in Dutch's mind. Hosea disagreed. Quietly, he had seen the pattern in the questions, the way those strangers talked about coordination between territories, about rail companies and banks sharing information, about private agencies hired to do what local law could not. It was the living embodiment of a new kind of hunt, one that would not tire, one that could follow trails on paper long after hoofprints had washed away. The response at first was subtle. Routes were shifted off main roads toward harsher country. Old campfires were buried and doused, not merely abandoned. Ledgers, letters, and anything that tied one job to another went into the flames. Certain towns, once easy pickings, became off-limits overnight. Dutch framed it as prudence, as proof of his genius. Hosea treated it as the first concession to a future he already feared. Because if investigators could trace a story from its humble beginnings in backwater holdups to more daring robberies, what happened when men with badges and budgets decided this van der Linde gang was more than a nuisance? What happened when those polite questions turned into wanted posters, into task forces, into Pinkertons riding with federal blessing? For now, the storm sat on the horizon, distant and almost abstract, a rumor carried by telegraph wires and railroad tracks. But it was moving. Every burned ledger, every detour through the wilderness, every job done a little faster, a little colder, was a quiet admission that the cat-and-mouse game had already begun. The hunters had taken their first look at Dutch's dream of freedom. Soon enough, they would not be asking questions. They would be coming straight for the family he had built. The hunters were coming, but before the Pinkertons ever knew Dutch's name, hunger had already begun to test his philosophy. There was a season, early on, when the gang's greatest enemy was not civilization or the O'Driscolls. It was an empty pot and a long winter. Snow closed the passes in the Grizzlies, and the easy scores dried up along with the rivers. A string of failed swindles, a stagecoach that never showed, a payroll shipment rerouted at the last minute one by one. The sure things collapsed. From its humble beginnings, this was supposed to be a story of clever men outwitting a corrupt world. Instead, the campfires burned low, the horses grew thin, and tempers sharpened in the cold. Dutch had always promised his people a different outlaw life. Steal from the rich, never from the desperate. Hit the railroads, the bankers, the bloated merchants who hid behind badges and ledgers. It was a code that made the gang feel, in the truest sense, like more than common bandits. But codes are easy when the saddlebags are full. One night, with the wind howling through the pines and the stew stretched with too much water, Dutch laid out a new set of targets. Small homesteads tucked in lonely valleys. Stagecoaches whose passengers might be ranchers, might be drifters, might be families. Less certainty, more risk, and far less nobility. The world was changing, he warned them, and the old ways were dying. Railroads were guarding their gold with soldiers, banks were hiring private armies, and the law was learning their tricks. What mattered more, pride or survival? Around the fire, the debate cut deeper than any knife. Some, especially the younger guns hungry for coin and reputation, were eager. To them, a wallet was a wallet, a score was a score. They heard only the growl in their stomachs and the promise of full pockets by morning. Others heard something darker, the first cracks in Dutch's carefully crafted philosophy. Hosea sat quiet for a long time, turning his tin cup in his hands, watching Dutch as much as listening. Annabelle, who had seen Dutch at his most idealistic and his most impulsive, spoke first. If they started robbing the very people they claimed to defend, what separated them from Colm and his cutthroats? Was this still a family built on shared dreams of freedom, or just another gang chasing easy money? Hosea backed her, gently but firmly. There were lines, he argued, that once crossed could never be uncrossed. A story of loyalty and betrayal did not begin with a bullet. It began with a compromise. In the end, they found a middle path, or told themselves they did. A wealthy cattle buyer traveling under guard, carrying cash meant to pay ranch hands who had not yet seen a cent. Technically, he fit the code, rich, exploitative, well-connected. But the money in his strongbox already had names on it, and everyone around that fire knew it. They hit the coach, hard and fast, and no one innocent died. The gang rode away heavier with coin and lighter in spirit. Hunger was answered, for a time, but the line had moved. If this was acceptable, what would the next hard season demand? Somewhere in that snowbound camp, a quiet truth settled over them. Ideals were not shattered in a single moment. They were worn down, one necessary exception at a time, until even the living embodiment of Dutch's dream could no longer remember the very beginning. That quiet truth followed them down from the mountains and into a gentler place. After the blizzards and blood, the gang's next chapter began not with a gunshot, but with running water and birdsong. They found it in a low, hidden valley, where a river bent in on itself and the cottonwoods grew thick along the banks. An abandoned ranch sagged on a rise above the water, its fences gray and broken, its barn half collapsed, but the bones were still good. Steep hills watched the approaches. The river gave them fish, the trees gave them cover. From its humble beginnings as a forgotten homestead, it became the first place that felt, in the truest sense, like home. Dutch saw more than a ruin. He saw a proving ground for his philosophy. If outlaws could build something here, even briefly, then the dream of freedom from civilization was not just a story told around the fire. Hosea walked the perimeter, counting lines of sight and escape routes, while Annabelle ran a hand along the porch rail, already imagining curtains and a mended roof. For a moment, these three were not fugitives. They were founders. They set to work. Broken windows were boarded, then replaced. The front steps were re-nailed and swept clean. The barn doors were dragged back into place with curses and laughter, until the horses could sleep under a roof again. Someone carved initials into the porch post, one after another, a rough roll call of a growing family that refused to admit it was temporary. Dutch talked about planting a little garden. Hosea joked about charging rent. Routines formed with surprising speed. Mornings meant coffee on the steps, the river mist rising while plans for the day were laid out. Afternoons brought target practice down by the water, or quiet card games at the kitchen table, the clack of chips blending with the creak of the old house. At dusk, the valley filled with the smell of stew and tobacco, with low voices and the occasional burst of song. For once, the gun oil and the laughter did not feel at odds. There were small celebrations. A job gone clean meant extra meat in the pot, and a bottle passed around the fire. Someone would pull out a battered fiddle, someone else would dance badly in the dust, and even Dutch, the living embodiment of grand speeches and impossible dreams, would simply lean back and watch. Nights like that made the outlaw life feel almost reasonable. Who would trade this for a cramped cell or a factory floor? Yet beneath the peace, the world was changing. Riders were seen on distant ridges more often. Railroad tracks crept closer in rumor and in fact. A Pinkerton name surfaced in town, spoken with the same wary respect once reserved for famous gunmen. The old ways were dying, even here, in a valley that seemed carved out of an earlier century. Hosea noticed first. The questions came in private, in low conversations on the darkened porch. How long could they really stay? How many initials could be carved before someone came to erase them? Dutch brushed the doubts away, but the pattern was already set. Every safe haven was only a pause in a story of pursuit. In time, the ranch would be abandoned again, its patched roof sagging, its porch scarred with the names of men and women scattered or dead. The river would keep running, the birds would keep singing. But for the Linde gang, this early refuge was a promise and a warning, no matter how real the dream felt. The world would always find them, but the world would not always come for them in the dead of night or the quiet of the woods. Sometimes it rode in broad daylight, wearing a badge or a banker's smile. The first real test of Dutch's philosophy came in a growing frontier town that had gone from muddy crossroads to railroad stop in a handful of years. The tracks had brought money, and the money had brought a man named Silas Trammell, a railroad foreman and land speculator, who was the living embodiment of the new order. He underpaid workers, seized parcels from desperate farmers, and paid the sheriff to look the other way. For Dutch, from its humble beginnings, this was a story of opportunity and outrage intertwined. Dutch watched Trammell's world with a cold, almost academic interest at first. Here was civilization in the truest sense. Neat ledgers hiding broken backs, printed contracts masking betrayal. He listened to workers in the saloon talk about wages withheld and families threatened with eviction. Hosea, ever the pragmatist, saw a profitable target. Dutch saw something grander. Why rob a train in the wilderness when the real theft was happening in the middle of town? He gathered the gang in a dim back room above the livery, lantern light flickering over faces, still believing in his dream. Dutch spoke of freedom and family, of the old ways were dying under iron rails and crooked law. This would not be a simple robbery, he said. This would be a stand. They would hit Trammell's office, seize his payroll, burn his false records, and hand coin back to the men who earned it. Was that not justice? Was that not a story the town would remember? Hosea listened, measuring each word, weighing the risk against the reward. Annabelle watched Dutch with a softer, more private worry, sensing how much of himself he was pouring into this performance. To them, the plan still had the shape of a con: distract the sheriff, isolate Trammell, be gone before the smoke cleared. But Dutch's rhetoric had teeth. It turned a job into a cause, a theft into a rebellion. The morning of the job broke bright and deceptively calm. Dutch strolled down the main street in a borrowed suit, all charm and righteous indignation, confronting Trammell on the steps of his office while Hosea slipped inside with a forged court order. For a brief moment, it almost worked. The sheriff hesitated. Townsfolk gathered. The illusion held. Then a nervous deputy recognized Hosea, shouted a name, and the spell shattered. A gun went off. No one would later agree who fired first, and the street exploded into chaos. Dutch's men returned fire from doorways and horse troughs as civilians screamed and scattered. A woman fell on the boardwalk. A boy was pinned behind a water barrel, sobbing as bullets chewed the dust around him. This was not the clean, principled stand Dutch had promised. This was gunpowder and panic. They fought their way out in a storm of splintered wood and shattered glass, dragging saddlebags heavy with coin that suddenly felt far too light. The gang escaped to the hills, leaving behind a town choked with smoke and grief. A place that had just learned what it meant when ideals met lead. That night, around the fire, Dutch framed the day as a victory. Trammell had been humbled, the sheriff exposed. The people shown that power could bleed. The dead, he said, were casualties in a larger war against oppression. His voice was steady, his eyes bright with conviction. Or perhaps with delusions he could no longer distinguish from truth. Hosea sat quietly, turning a gold coin over in his fingers, wondering what had really changed. Annabelle watched the flames and thought of the woman on the boardwalk, of the boy behind the barrel, and knew some part of Dutch's dream had shifted. The gang had won money and a reputation, but it had also crossed an invisible line. From that day, Dutch's speeches would always carry the echo of gunfire, his philosophy forever shadowed by the cost of proving it. And in the distance, the railroad kept rolling, indifferent, a reminder that the world was changing faster than any outlaw's promise. The gunfire faded, but around the campfire, Dutch made sure the echo never quite died. Nights in those early camps became their own theater, glowing circles of light in a world closing in, where Dutch could take a messy job and, with a cigar in his hand and an audience at his feet, turn it into a story of purpose and destiny. He would start small. A botched coach robbery became a triumph of principle, not profit. The part where Bill panicked and shot too soon? In Dutch's retelling, that became quick thinking under pressure, a brave stand against the agents of civilization. The terrified driver begging for his life faded into the background, replaced by Dutch's booming voice about freedom, family, and standing up to a rigged world that wanted them all in chains. For the newer faces around the fire, this was the very beginning of their education. They had not seen Dutch hesitate, had not watched Hosea pull him away from killing a man who did not need to die. They had not heard the arguments in the trees afterward. They only knew the polished version, the legend recited in the glow of flame and whiskey. To them, Dutch was the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy, a man who never made mistakes, only statements. Hosea sat there too. Sometimes he corrected details, lightly, almost playfully. The bank had not been quite that full. The law had not been quite that blind. The escape had needed more luck than Dutch admitted. Other times he said nothing, only gave a small, knowing look when Dutch rewrote an ugly moment as noble necessity. A raised eyebrow here, a quiet sip of coffee there. He chose his battles carefully, understanding that challenging the story too often meant challenging Dutch himself. In those silences, a second story ran beneath the first, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of what the gang had truly done to keep its name alive. The old ways were dying, and Dutch could feel it. Each tale grew grander, more idealistic, more insistent that they were heroes rather than outlaws clinging to a fading frontier. It worked. Around those fires, pride took root. Men who had simply wanted money began to believe they were soldiers in a war against civilization. Women who had fled hard lives began to see the camp as sanctuary in the truest sense, blessed by Dutch's words. Who wanted to question a man who made them feel that their sins were sacrifices, their crimes a necessary tax on a corrupt world? But each embellished story also pushed the truth a little further away. The blood on their hands became abstract, the bodies left behind reduced to symbols. Dutch was not just escaping the law, he was escaping consequence itself, climbing into a legend he controlled, and as more recruits arrived who only knew that legend, the gang drifted further from its humble beginnings and closer to the edge where belief and reality would finally collide. But legends have a cost, and the first person to truly count that cost was Annabelle. It happened after one of those jobs that marked the shift from idealistic rebellion to something harsher. Dutch and Hosea had planned an ambush on a private convoy moving company money and payroll through a canyon, a quiet contract that no one in the newspapers would mourn. The gang hit hard, blew the lockboxes, and left a trail of dead guards in the dust. Dutch rode back to camp spattered with blood, laughing, telling the story as if it were a grand joke at civilization's expense. For the newer recruits, he was the living embodiment of freedom. For Annabelle, watching from the firelight, something felt wrong. This was not the man who once insisted that killing was a last resort, that their philosophy meant protecting the weak and humiliating the powerful, not butchering hired men just trying to feed their families. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but this felt less like evolution and more like drift. Later, when the camp had quieted and the bottles were low, she found him by the edge of the river, cleaning his revolver. Her voice was gentle, but it did not waver. She asked when the line had moved. When had a story of resistance turned into a tally of bodies? Did he still believe in the same principles he had preached to her from the very beginning, when it was just Dutch, Hosea, and a dream of living outside the reach of corrupt lawmen and railroad men? Dutch smiled first. That was always his instinct. He wrapped his charm around the questions, told her the world was harsher now, that the Pinkertons were closing in, that men in uniforms had chosen their side. He said those guards had made their decision, that loyalty to the rich was betrayal of freedom in the truest sense. Was he supposed to let his family die for strangers? But beneath the smile, something tightened. When she pressed again, quietly pointing out that he had enjoyed it, that he had come back more triumphant than troubled, his eyes hardened. He reminded her of all he had done, of the mouths he fed, of the lost soul he had taken in and turned into a man, as if her doubt were an insult to every sacrifice he imagined himself making. Being questioned by others was one thing. Being questioned by Annabelle cut deeper. A flicker of anger surfaced, quick and sharp. He accused her, not of betrayal, but of failing to understand what leadership demanded. Then, just as quickly, he softened, pulled her close, promised that the dream was intact, that this was only a phase, a necessary ugliness on the road to a better world. Annabelle stayed. She put her head against his shoulder, listened to him speak of dreams and destiny, and said nothing more. But she was shaken. In that quiet, she sensed that the man she loved and the legend he was becoming were beginning to diverge, and that one day the legend might win. The next tragedy would prove her right. The next tragedy was not a single bullet or a single body. It was reputation. It was the moment the Linde gang stopped being just a band of thieves and became a story told by strangers in places Dutch had never seen. By the time Arthur Morgan's path was drifting toward them, rumors were already moving faster than any horse. In smoky saloons, men leaned over chipped glasses and spoke of a charismatic outlaw who quoted books, paid for the piano player, and robbed the railroad men on their way home. In cramped train cars, respectable travelers whispered about a gang that took the strongbox, apologized to the passengers, and left a little money for a crying widow. Around campfires, drifters repeated half-true tales of Dutch's philosophy, of an idealistic outlaw who claimed to fight civilization itself. These stories did not agree on the details, but they agreed on one thing: Dutch van der Linde was different. To some, he was the living embodiment of frontier freedom, a man who refused to bow as the world was changing. To others, he was a dangerous fraud, dressing greed up as justice. Either way, his name traveled. So did the name of his gang. From its humble beginnings as two conmen running small-town scams, the operation had become a regional legend. Wanted posters bearing Dutch and Hosea's faces spread from one lonely sheriff's office to the next, tacked crookedly to bulletin boards, nailed to church doors, slapped onto the walls of train depots. At first, the bounties were almost insulting. Then they rose. $50, $100, $200 for Dutch, dead or alive, as county lines turned into state lines and lawmen began to talk to one another. What began as isolated complaints became coordination. Marshals shared information over telegraph wires. Pinkerton agents compared notes on robberies that felt too clean, too theatrical, be coincidence. A bank clerk in one town described Dutch's accent. A stagecoach driver in another remembered Hosea's easy smile. Piece by piece, the myth was being mapped. For Dutch, this was both warning and fuel. The growing notoriety fed his ego in the truest sense, proof that his words and his violence were leaving a mark on a world that he believed had no place for men like him. Around the campfire, he would hear a new rumor about himself, laugh, correct it, then quietly adopt the better version. The legend was no longer just following the gang. It was leading them. The others felt it too. Pride crept into the way they rode into town, into the way they spoke about their family. They were feared, admired, and hunted all at once. Yet every new poster, every higher bounty, made their way of life less sustainable. Safe towns vanished. Old hideouts became too well known. Each job had to be bigger to justify the risk, each escape narrower than the last. The gang stood at a turning point, balanced between dreams and delusions, between freedom and the tightening grip of civilization. Powerful, bonded, and already compromised, they rode beneath a sky heavy with consequences they could not yet see. Somewhere out there, a young lost soul named Arthur Morgan was learning to steal and to survive, unaware that his arrival would test Dutch's legend more than any lawman ever could. The legend usually starts with Arthur Morgan. The reality starts long before his name is ever spoken around a campfire. In dime novels and whispered saloon tales, Dutch's outfit becomes a story of noble bandits, of outlaws riding for the poor against a cruel civilization. But the harsher, messier truth is that by the time Arthur appears, that legend is already a polished mask. The real face of the van der Linde gang is forged in the years when it is just Dutch, Hosea, a handful of believers, and a world that refuses to bend. From its humble beginnings, their dream sounds almost pure. Two con men meet trying to rob each other, share a laugh instead of bullets, and decide the world is easier to fool than to fear. Dutch brings the speeches, the philosophy, the hatred of authority. Hosea brings the patience, the craft, the quiet sense that dreams without limits can turn to delusions. Together they imagine a roaming family, stealing from the rich, sheltering the desperate, living beyond the reach of the law in the truest sense of freedom. Annabelle is there in those early days, not just as Dutch's lover, but as the living embodiment of what he thinks he is fighting for: warmth in the cold, tenderness in a brutal frontier. Her presence softens him, reins him in, gives the gang's violence a boundary. When Dutch talks about a better world, she is the face he sees. And then there is Colm O'Driscoll. At the very beginning, he is not a monster in Dutch's mythology, but a mirror, another ambitious outlaw, another man railing that the old ways were dying, another leader gathering lost souls under a banner of freedom. For a brief moment, Dutch and Colm are almost allies, circling the same targets, testing each other's nerve. Their rivalry, and Colm's eventual betrayal will carve the gang's identity deeper than any speech. Annabelle's death at Colm's hands turns a feud into a crusade. The gang's jobs grow bolder, the body count higher, the line between rebellion and revenge thinner with every raid. This is where Dutch's charm curdles into paranoia, where his flexible code begins to twist. Is he fighting for the people, or just against the man who hurt him? By the time Arthur rides in, the answer is already complicated. He is not joining a fresh experiment, he is stepping into a story already weighed down with scars, loyalties, and quiet compromises that no one wants to name out loud. Understanding this pre-Arthur era reframes everything that follows. Dutch's grand speeches, John's doubts at Blackwater, even Micah's poison later on, all grow from seeds planted in those early years. The remaining journey will walk back through those turning points, not to polish the legend, but to see who these people really were when the dream still felt possible. Because the legend of the Van der Linde gang does not begin as a death march. It begins as something hopeful and fragile, already doomed by the contradictions that were there from the start. To see those contradictions clearly, the story has to step back even further, to a restless boy who never quite belonged in the world he was born into. Before the gang, before Arthur, there was Dutch Van der Linde, the preacher's son who listened to sermons on Sunday and watched his father break under the same institutions he praised. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's life was a lesson in disappointment. His mother died too young, leaving a wound he never allowed to heal, only to harden. His father, a man of the cloth, preached humility and charity, yet could not protect his own family from poverty, illness, or the slow, grinding indifference of civilization. In Dutch's mind, that was not just tragedy, it was betrayal. So he turned to other teachers, dime novels about noble outlaws, political pamphlets railing against monopolies and government overreach, traveling orators promising that the individual could stand above the law if only he had the courage. Dutch devoured them all. He built a private philosophy from their pages, a story of freedom where the brave man answered to no king, no banker, no railroad baron. If the world was changing, then he would change faster. From the very beginning, his hatred was not for morality itself, but for hypocrisy. Churches that hoarded donations while preaching sacrifice. Politicians who shouted about liberty while sending Pinkertons to crush strikes and burn out tenant farmers. Dutch watched, listened, and came to a simple conclusion. The law was not justice. It was a cage. His first crimes were clumsy attempts to break that cage. A stagecoach robbed with more bravado than planning. A crooked merchant shaken down after a long, angry speech about fair prices. A small-town bank window smashed in the night. More to prove a point than to secure a payday. He was impulsive, driven by anger and ego, but even then he wrapped every theft in grand language about the poor and the oppressed. Was he helping them or performing for them? Meeting Hosea Matthews gave that wild energy a spine. Their first encounter, two conmen accidentally trying to rob each other, was almost a joke, but it revealed something crucial. Hosea had patience where Dutch had fire. Hosea could see the world as it really was, in the truest sense, while Dutch insisted on seeing what it could be. Together, they refined the act. The cons became smoother, the robberies cleaner, the violence more controlled. Yet the duality in Dutch never disappeared. He could share food with a starving family one day, then rob a train the next and call the blood on the tracks the price of progress. He was the living embodiment of the old ways were dying, and he refused to go quietly. His speeches inspired loyalty, his presence turned drifters into disciples, but every success also fed his belief that his dreams could justify anything. The Dutch Arthur would later follow was already there in those early years, brilliant, magnetic, and dangerous. A man who truly wanted to shield the weak from a cruel civilization, yet loved the theater of rebellion and the sound of his own voice just as much. The tragedy is that he did not become a lost soul overnight. The seeds of both his greatness and his downfall were planted long before a young Arthur Morgan rode into camp, and the next chapter of this story will show how Hosea, Annabelle, and a first taste of real family made those seeds grow. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang was not a crowd around a campfire, but a triangle: Dutch, Hosea, and Annabelle. Before Arthur, before John, before the name carried fear across the frontier, this was the first family Dutch ever chose, in the truest sense, and everything that followed grew out of that fragile balance. Hosea Matthews was never a sidekick. He was Dutch's equal, the quiet strategist standing half a step behind only so he could see the whole board. Where Dutch filled rooms with words and philosophy, Hosea filled silences with questions. Could the plan be smaller? Could the risk be less? Could the dream survive if they walked away from one more tempting score? He could talk Dutch down from a ledge without raising his voice, and Dutch, in those early years, still listened. Hosea's skepticism did not come from cowardice, but from experience. He had tried honest work, tried living under the rules of civilization, and watched how the law bent to wealth and power. That failure made him receptive to Dutch's ideals about freedom and resistance, yet it also made him wary of letting rhetoric outrun reality. He knew how easily an idealistic story of rebellion could become an excuse for cruelty. So he became the brake to Dutch's engine, the man who would poke holes in a scheme, then help patch them well enough that no one died who did not have to. Annabelle brought something neither man possessed. To outsiders, she might have seemed only Dutch's lover, but around the fire she was the emotional buffer who absorbed his doubts before they spilled into fury. After the first broken codes, the first time a hostage bled out or a promise to a town went unkept, Dutch would pace, rant about the world changing and the old ways were dying, and then fall quiet beside her. She listened. She soothed his guilt, not by excusing him, but by reminding him why the gang existed at all. Together, the three of them became a living embodiment of the gang's early ideal. Dutch the visionary father, Hosea the pragmatic uncle, Annabelle the heart that made every crude hideout feel like home rather than a den of outlaws. Newcomers did not learn the code from speeches alone. They watched Dutch hand his own plate to a hungry drifter, saw Hosea slip coins to a widow whose husband had been collateral, heard Annabelle insist that women and children be fed first. Around those first camps, arguments over where the line should be drawn were as common as shared meals. How much violence was too much? When did self-defense become vengeance? Those debates, half philosophy and half survival, shaped the nights that Arthur would later remember. The stories, the music, the belief that this was a family standing against a rigged world, not just criminals hiding from the noose. Annabelle's presence kept Dutch from tipping fully into rage or despair, buying the gang years of relative stability. But a balance that depends on three people is delicate. Once that first family was broken, once Annabelle was taken and Hosea slowly pushed aside, there would be nothing left to catch Dutch when he finally fell. When that first family shattered, the jobs began to change. The story of the Linde gang shifted from its humble beginnings, as a roaming band of principled thieves into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. What started as a creed about freedom became a campaign. In the very beginning, Dutch and Hosea chose targets that fit the philosophy. Small-town banks run by smug little tyrants, stagecoaches heavy with railroad money, corrupt landowners who used the law to bleed farmers dry. They robbed a banker in Kansas who foreclosed on widows, then left envelopes of cash on doorsteps that same night. They stopped a coach carrying a judge who sold sentences to the highest bidder and handed his fees back to the men he had ruined. It was, in the truest sense, an outlaw sermon preached with guns and charm. Their early hideouts reflected that idealistic mood. Shacks on the edge of nowhere, caves above forgotten trails, clearings in the forest where the firelight threw long shadows and the talk ran longer still. There were arguments about civilization and the future, about whether the world was changing for better or worse. But there was laughter, too. Shared loot passed hand to hand, not because anyone was rich, but because they believed they were building something. Around those fires, it felt less like a gang and more like a movement. Success, however, never stays secret. The more Dutch humiliated local authorities and rich men, the more attention he attracted. Sheriffs began trading stories. Marshals started comparing notes. Then the Pinkertons appeared on the horizon, the living embodiment of corporate power in a badge and a ledger. What had been daring rides with pistols and bandanas turned into operations with dynamite, repeating rifles, and strict timings. Every new score demanded tighter planning, heavier firepower, and more people who could be trusted not to run. With that escalation came the first real fractures. A bank job that went wrong when an innocent clerk pulled a gun and caught a bullet he never deserved. A train robbery where a panicked guard fired into a crowd, turning a clean getaway into a field of bodies. Ambushes by the O'Driscolls on trails the gang thought were safe, Colm's men waiting behind rocks and trees, forcing Dutch to decide in seconds whether to cut losses or stand and fight. More than once, he chose escalation over retreat, not just to save his people, but to protect his legend. Each new enemy pushed them deeper into war. Camps grew more fortified, with sentries posted through the night. Safe houses rotated from valley to valley. The scores got bigger, riskier, further from the simple rob the rich theatrics that had defined their youth. Bodies piled up. Grudges deepened. Dutch's speeches had to work harder to paint bloodshed as justice, to insist this was still a story of freedom and not just survival. A pattern was forming, one Arthur would later walk straight into. One last big job, then the gang would disappear. One last town, one last train, one last fortune. But every last job only tightened the noose, drawing more law, more Pinkertons, more vengeful rivals into their orbit. By the time Arthur Morgan stood at Dutch's side, the van der Linde gang was no longer a scrappy band of noble thieves. It was a small army with a long list of enemies, a past it could not outrun, and a leader determined to prove that his dream had not already died. The O'Driscoll feud was not an interruption to Dutch's story. It became the story. A private war that began as a business arrangement and ended as a mirror of everything he was becoming. From its humble beginnings, the connection between Dutch van der Linde and Colm O'Driscoll was almost darkly comic. Two ambitious young outlaws, both silver-tongued, both convinced the world owed them more, once sat at the same tables and planned jobs together. For a brief moment, they were partners in crime and in philosophy, railing against civilization, against railroads and bankers and the noose. But neither man could share a spotlight. In the truest sense, each needed to be the center of his own legend. The first cracks came quietly, a stagecoach job where Colm's boys arrived late and claimed a bigger cut, a train robbery where Dutch swore a satchel of bonds had vanished between camp and rendezvous. Then came the ambushes, riders in the dark, shots from the tree line, O'Driscoll boys where only Dutch's men should have been. What began as a dispute over percentages turned into a chain of betrayals, of double-crossed jobs and stolen loot, until every meeting felt like bait and every handshake felt like a lie. That tension soon spilled blood. Early van der Linde members, men and women whose names would never be whispered in saloons, were killed or maimed in backcountry skirmishes that gained nothing and proved even less. Annabelle watched Dutch swing between charm and fury, between grand speeches about freedom and nights where he rode out alone, hunting O'Driscolls through the pines. Hosea tried to pull him back, reminding him of their original dream, warning that this was pride, not principle. Dutch listened, then rode out again. The war twisted his code. At the very beginning, Dutch insisted they did not kill unless forced, that they did not hurt innocents because they were better than the men who ruled this world. But revenge has its own gravity. Retaliations hit homesteads that only half belonged to Colm. A stable torched because an O'Driscoll cousin might be inside. Men dragged from their beds, beaten and tortured for information that often turned out to be rumor. Choices were made not to feed the gang or keep them safe, but to make Colm suffer. Yet Dutch told himself a story of necessary cruelty, of a world that struck first, of an enemy so vicious that any response was justified. Colm became the living embodiment of everything Dutch claimed to fight: corruption, brutality, betrayal, if Dutch went too far. It was only because the old ways were dying and monsters had to be met with monsters. Wasn't he still fighting for the weak, even as bodies piled up in ditches and shallow graves? That habit, turning personal grudges into grand causes, would echo through the years. The Pinkertons were not just lawmen, they were tyrants threatening his philosophy. Leviticus Cornwall was not just a magnate, he was the face of a rigged civilization. Later, even his own doubting gang members would become traitors to the dream rather than frightened people questioning a leader who had lost his way. By the time Arthur Morgan rode into this world, the O'Driscoll rivalry was more than an old feud. It was a ghost at Dutch's shoulder, a reminder of every time he chose pride over prudence, vengeance over survival. The legend would claim Dutch was betrayed by the world, that progress and law crushed a noble outlaw. The truth was quieter and far more tragic. He had been betraying his own ideals for years. One bullet, one body, one O'Driscoll at a time. And the next great test of that crumbling philosophy was already waiting, in the shape of a teenage lost soul Dutch believed he could still save. Arthur did not ride into a blank slate. He rode into a story already half told, a camp already haunted. By the time that teenage lost soul came under Dutch's wing, the van der Linde gang was less a new experiment and more a worn machine, its gears grinding through the same motions of robbery, escape, and rationalization. Around the campfire, the rituals were set. Dutch spoke, others listened. The bottles were passed in a certain order, the watch rotations never changed. And the unspoken hierarchies were already carved deep. Bill Williamson took the first shift on guard, still desperate to prove he was not a coward. Javier played the guitar, trying to drown out memories of failed revolutions. The stories told at night were carefully curated, triumphs exaggerated, disasters softened, betrayals blamed on outsiders. Newcomers stepped into these patterns, not questioning who had decided them in the very beginning. At the center of it all stood Dutch, the living embodiment of his own philosophy. His leadership, forged in those early years with Hosea, had hardened into a predictable pattern, a grand speech about freedom, a risky plan to prove the gang's purpose, and, when the consequences came due, a refusal to admit fault. If a job went wrong, it was the Pinkertons, the O'Driscolls, civilization itself conspiring against them. Never Dutch, never the plan. How many times would that rhythm repeat before it finally broke the people around him? Hosea had once been an equal partner in the truest sense, the other half of a duo that robbed trains and stagecoaches from its humble beginnings with wit instead of gunfire. By the time Arthur arrived, that balance had shifted. Hosea still advised, still cautioned, still argued for smaller scores and quieter exits, but Dutch now treated his counsel as an option rather than a rule. When the promise of a bigger haul appeared, the old man's voice became background noise, respected in theory, sidelined in practice. The scars of the O'Driscoll War lay beneath everything. Annabelle's death, the endless cycle of ambushes and reprisals, had left Dutch more brittle and more possessive of his own legend. He could not afford to be wrong. Because to be wrong would mean that all that blood, all that grief, had been for nothing. So the speeches grew louder, the justifications more elaborate, the enemies more absolute. Compromise felt like weakness. Doubt felt like betrayal. Into this stepped Arthur Morgan. He did not just join an outlaw gang, he joined a mythology, a story of underdogs striking back at a rigged world. Around him, Dutch was still charming, still idealistic, still capable of tenderness and generosity. Those qualities were real, but already fraying at the edges, already competing with pride and paranoia. Arthur's loyalty formed around a version of Dutch that had once existed, but only partially, and only for a while. So when Dutch's plans shifted without warning, when the promise of one last score kept moving further away, when traitors seemed to appear in every shadow, those were not sudden changes. They were echoes of choices made long before Arthur ever drew a gun for the gang. And with that history in mind, every quiet doubt in Arthur's eyes, every campfire conversation, every broken promise in Red Dead Redemption 2 does not just hurt more. It reveals how long the tragedy had been unfolding, and how impossible it might have been to stop. Because that is the heart of it. This tragedy did not begin with Arthur's tuberculosis, or Hosea's execution on the Saint Denis steps. It began with a man who believed in something real, then slowly bent that belief until it served only himself. Dutch van der Linde is a story of corrupted idealism, of a mind that could quote philosophy and poetry, while quietly rewriting every principle to justify the next robbery, the next body, the next betrayal. From its humble beginnings, the gang's history shows how rarely evil arrives in the truest sense as a monster at the door. It comes as a small compromise, wrapped in loyalty and necessity. One extra shot fired because Colm had it coming. One town hit harder than planned because the gang needed the money. One more promise that this will be the last bloody job before freedom. Each step is tiny, almost invisible. The path only looks horrifying when traced backward from the end. Hosea and Annabelle stand in that early darkness as proof that good influences can slow a fall, but cannot reverse it for someone who refuses to change course. Hosea challenged Dutch's wilder dreams, talked him down from pointless killings, and tried to keep the gang closer to its idealistic, Robin Hood-style robberies. Annabelle grounded Dutch, gave his restless energy a home, and for a time made his world feel less hostile. Yet when Colm O'Driscoll killed her, the restraint they had built together shattered, and Dutch chose vengeance over reflection. That choice reveals another truth. The gang's family dynamic is both salvation and trap. It is a refuge for every lost soul who cannot fit into the new, tightening grip of civilization. It offers warmth, purpose, and a code that feels nobler than the cold rules of banks and railroads. But that same devotion makes it almost impossible to admit when the family has become dangerous. How does a man like Arthur question the father who taught him to read, to shoot, to survive? How does John walk away from the only people who ever called him brother? The feud with the O'Driscolls turns this into a war of mirrors. By defining themselves against calm, we are not them, we are better than them. The Linde gang drifts closer to being exactly what it claims to fight. Each ambush answered with a massacre, each insult repaid with escalation, until the difference between outlaw and enemy becomes a story they tell around the fire rather than a reality on the ground. Seen through this longer history, Arthur's doubts in the mountains, John's desperate attempts to leave at Horseshoe Overlook, and Sadie's burning need for revenge after her husband's death all gain extra weight. Their choices echo patterns set in motion decades earlier. Their dreams of freedom are built on foundations already cracked. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's gang, once the living embodiment of resistance to that change, had become another engine of suffering. Perhaps that is why this story cuts so deep. It mirrors the human tendency to romanticize the past, to excuse heroes because they once meant well, to ignore warning signs until the cliff edge is under the horse's hooves. The pre-Arthur era is not just trivia, it is a lens that sharpens every replay, every campfire song, every farewell ride into the sunset. And as the tale moves toward Blackwater and the beginning of the end, those early choices will cast longer and longer shadows over every face in that doomed family. Those shadows are what make the ending hurt. Because this is not just a story of how a gang collapses, it is a story of how that gang had already been living with fractures long before Arthur ever rode in. From its humble beginnings, the arc is almost deceptively simple. Two rival conmen meet on a dusty road, each trying to rob the other, and end up laughing instead of bleeding. Dutch and Hosea move from petty schemes to a wandering partnership, refining a philosophy that dresses outlaw work in the language of freedom and justice. Then Annabelle enters, the steadying presence who turns drifting criminals into something that resembles a family, the very beginning of a world where Dutch believes he can be both revolutionary and patriarch. That illusion does not last. Colm O'Driscoll's betrayal and Annabelle's death transformed Dutch's dream into a crusade. The feud escalates from skirmishes in back alleys and ambushes on back roads into a private war that stains every campfire story with loss. The gang shifts from gentlemen thieves and confidence men to hardened raiders, from picking targets carefully to chasing vengeance and spectacle. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's answer is not to bend, but to double down. By the time Arthur Morgan joins, the Linde gang is not standing at a clean starting line. It is already deep into a long, complicated middle, shaped by grief, pride, and half-remembered ideals that have been compromised in practice again and again. The code Arthur learns has history. Every rule has a scar on it. How could his journey feel like anything except a burden carried on someone else's tired shoulders? Arthur becomes the living embodiment of that tension. He tries to live up to a philosophy its own author has been breaking for years, to save a family that has already buried too many of its dead. Each time he reins Dutch in, each time he questions a plan, the argument echoes Hosea's old warnings and Annabelle's absence, even if no one speaks her name. Is he defending a dream, or just delaying an ending that began the day Dutch chose revenge over restraint? Dutch's early compromises lead straight to his final betrayals. The man who once bent the rules to protect the weak slowly learns to bend them to protect his pride, then his plans, then only his legend. The line between stealing from the rich and feeding on anyone in reach blurs, then vanishes. What begins as resistance to civilization curdles into delusions of grandeur. Knowing this history changes every quiet moment in camp. A joke by the fire, an argument over a map, a silent stare across the flames becomes an echo of that older, bloodier story. When Dutch snaps, when Hosea sighs, when John walks away, those are not isolated scenes. They are the last verses of a song that started with Dutch, Hosea, and Annabelle on the road. Revisiting Red Dead Redemption 2 with this pre-Arthur era in mind turns the entire game into a haunted landscape. The O'Driscolls are no longer just enemies. They are ghosts of a broken friendship. Every time Dutch talks about freedom, the memory of early stagecoach jobs and no unnecessary killing lingers behind the words. Side missions, throwaway lines about Annabelle, offhand mentions of old scores and old hideouts all become windows into the years that shape these people before the player ever sees them. Even the first Red Dead Redemption shifts under this light. Dutch on that cliff, John chasing the remnants of a dream, the government closing in. All of it plays differently when the mind carries the image of two young conmen laughing on a road, or a woman whose death no one in the epilogue can quite forget. In the truest sense, the Vander Linde story is not just about how it ends at Blackwater or Beecher's Hope. It is about how it begins, how ideals harden into dogma, and how a family forged in defiance cannot outrun time, loss, and its own contradictions. Riding back through those games, listening for Hosea's cautions, for the unspoken name of Annabelle, for the distant thunder of the O'Driscoll War, turns every final ride into the fading light into something that lingers long after the credits roll.